The first thing Yuri noticed when he crossed the former German border was not the silence, but the shape of it. Sound did not vanish in the air like before. It bent, recoiled, as if the ruined trees and broken barns swallowed it out of duty. He had been walking for hours since the convoy was shelved somewhere near Gubin. The truck had burst into a curtain of white fire, and the men that had not been torn in half by shrapnel had scattered like ants kicked from their trail. No orders were shouted. No Dankmatter. Only the crunch of frozen soil beneath boots and the scent of burning canvas remained. Yuri kept walking because that's what he knew, not because he had somewhere to be. At 41, he was too old to run and too experienced to freeze. The war had stripped him of ideology and filled the hollow with routine. By the time the sky began to soften from black into iron gray, he had found a rail line that led eastward, abandoned, rusted, and curved unnaturally, like it had been bent by heat or hands. Alongside it, a signal tower stood, missing its top, half buried in ash and debris. He took shelter beneath it, wiping soot from a bench and letting his rifle hang from his shoulder like a tired limb. He had not fired it since Cielo. It had become less a weapon and more a walking stick. There were no trains, no patrols, not even scavengers. Only fields that looked drowned in gray, and buildings whose windows still wept smoke in their corners. He lit a cigarette from a matchbox he kept inside his boot. 3 left. He allowed himself one. The tobacco tasted like dust. The wind bit down against the station's broken wall and lifted the ashes sideways into the air, where they spun like snow that didn't want to fall. Yuri remembered the color of real snow. This wasn't it. He read the signs on the walls, all in German. But then, in faint red chalk, a line written in Russian. Do not wait for anyone. It was underlined twice. Fresh, not the kind of message left by a retreating unit. He stood, shook the ash from his coat, and followed the rail line for 2 more kilometers until it vanished into a ridge. No tunnel, no bridge. It simply vanished into a cliff wall that had been cracked open as if bombed from within. Inside, steel beams jutted out like ribs. A tunnel? Or something older? He stepped inside, and the air changed immediately. The cold was thicker, more stable. No wind. No words. His boots echoed once, and then the sound went flat. He stopped, held his breath. Nothing returned, not even his own. As he went deeper, the ground began to slope. Stone gave way to concrete. There were no markings, no construction signs, only the slow realization that the place had been meant to stay secret. Not hidden, erased, a pocket in the earth. He passed a rusted generator, Soviet-made, but it had been turned around, cables stripped and rerouted to the walls. Someone had repurposed it, fed the power into the rock. On one of the walls, he ran his gloved hand along a panel of scorched metal. Heat still radiated from behind it, but there was no flame, no wires, no sound. Like the stone itself was storing something. Yuri stopped when he reached a room that had no door, only a torn blackout curtain hanging crooked across the frame. He moved it aside. Inside, a long corridor lined with broken mirrors on both walls stretched into the dark. The mirrors were covered in dust, but here and there, handprints had cleared patches. Not recent, but not old either. He looked into one. His reflection showed him standing, motionless. But the background behind his mirrored self was not the corridor. It was a forest, the wrong forest, the one from before the war. He stepped back. The image flickered, snapped back to match the corridor. He wiped his eyes. Fatigue, he thought, or nerves. He had gone too far without rest. Still, he moved forward, and the mirror stopped reflecting altogether. Just black glass now, and the corridor bent left, then right, then narrowed until he reached another chamber. There, stacked neatly along the wall, were boxes marked with Soviet stamps. He opened one. Not supplies, tapes, recordings, labeled in Russian and German. One word repeated again and again, Stimmy, voice. In the far corner of the room, a radio console sat, dead, but beside it, a switch was still intact, labeled only with a date, April 3rd, 45. He didn't flip it. Not yet. He sat down and opened his field notebook, which hadn't been touched in weeks. No one would read it, but it helped to put things on paper, to see them outside the mind. He wrote, entered structure west of Eisenhuttenstadt. Not mapped. Found no personnel. Temperature constant. Shadows move without source. Reflections inconsistent. Voice may be present in static. No contact with command. Then he crossed it all out. He lit a second cigarette. 2 left now. And listened. By the time we reached the outskirts of the village, the air had shifted. It wasn't colder, not exactly, but it felt like it moved differently, as if the wind had been instructed not to enter. Sergeant Faulkner walked ahead with his rifle lowered, boots crunching against brittle frost that seemed to cling to the earth like a skin unwilling to shed. I trailed behind, counting my steps without realizing. Something about the silence kept me anchored to the rhythm. 37 paces to the first structure, a collapsed barn with a rotted beam split down the center. 62 more to a stone house whose windows had been bricked over from the inside. No curtains, no signs of life, just decisions made in desperation. Bellin remained quiet, his gloved fingers folded behind his back. He studied everything, not like a soldier, but like a man remembering something he'd already seen. One of the privates, Kemp, spat to the side, the sound sharp as a crack. It felt like an intrusion. Even the birds weren't watching. We moved deeper, crossing what must have once been a main road, though no markings remained. The cobblestones had fused with the soil and snow. Buildings leaned into one another like old men whispering. A signpost, half-charred and written in Gothic script. Read only will, the rest blackened by smoke. Near it, a bicycle with both tires burst sat upright against the wall, dusted in fine white. It hadn't fallen. Someone had placed it there long ago and never returned. We took shelter in what might have been a town hall. Its door still locked but splintered enough to force open. Inside, papers clung to the corners of the floor like fallen feathers. Names, numbers, ledgers of grain, fuel, lists of villagers now rendered irrelevant by whatever had happened here. No bullet holes, no blood, just absence, the kind that echoes without sound. At dusk, we set up camp on the second floor. Bellin unrolled a cloth map with trembling hands. The old paper refused to lie flat. He pointed to a patch near the base of the mountain, where a tunnel had once been documented, then erased. It was here, he said, and then it wasn't. He didn't need to say more. We all understood what it meant when maps changed without reason. Kemp asked why we didn't just blow the place and leave. Faulkner answered for all of us. Because no one above us wants to admit this place still exists. That night, the cold was sharper, not because of the temperature, but because of what none of us dared to ask. Why the locals had never returned. Why there were no signs of struggle, only preparation. Why everything felt paused, not ruined. Sometime past midnight, a noise stirred us. Not loud, but deliberate. A creaking rhythmic, like a door slowly rocked by unseen hands. We checked the perimeter, rifles drawn. Nothing moved, but the noise returned. Bellin traced it to a stairwell leading down. Beneath the hall, a locked hatch. We pried it open. A ladder descended into dry air. No smell of mold or rot. Just us, perfectly undisturbed. Faulkner looked at Bellin. The older man nodded once, the kind of nod you give when you're already halfway to a decision. I volunteered to go first. The others followed, one by one, into a basement that should have been too small for what we found. The walls stretched longer than the dimensions above would allow. Brick gave way to smooth concrete, marked by symbols too faded to place. A corridor extended north, lit faintly by phosphorescent streaks that weren't light, just some chemical residue. We walked in silence. At the end, a door stood open. Inside, shelves lined the walls, each filled with reels of film. Unlabeled, dustless. Bellin reached for one and held it to the dim light. No scratches. It had been preserved. But how? We brought nothing up with us. Just questions, and a cold that wouldn't leave our bones, no matter how many blankets we wrapped ourselves in. By morning, something had shifted again. The snow outside had melted in patches, revealing a pattern beneath, circles, carved into the dirt, too precise to be natural. the kind used in mapping coordinates or containment fields. Bellen's hands trembled as he stared at them. He didn't speak, just stood there until the frost returned and covered everything again. And in that moment, I realized we weren't surveying ruins. We were trespassing on something that had never truly ended. The next morning brought no sunlight. Only a kind of pale, strained illumination filtered through a ceiling of motionless clouds. It didn't feel like dawn, more like a place where night simply ceased to deepen. We stepped outside in silence, and for a brief moment, none of us spoke. There was no wind, no bird, no sound at all beyond the subtle creak of leather and canvas from our gear. The air had a weight to it, not heavy in pressure, but dense in something older, like breathing through memory. Bellen stood near the etched patterns we'd seen, beneath the snow. The frost had returned tonight, but avoided those markings entirely. As if the cold recognized a boundary, he traced one circle with his boot and crouched beside it. No words, just the rigid stillness of a man staring at something he'd seen before, but hoped he'd never find again. Faulkner approached from the eastern edge of the clearing with a cigarette unlit between his teeth. "There's more," he muttered. "Behind the mill. A spiral. Looks Roman." But it wasn't Roman. Not even close. Behind the mill was a recess in the hillside, half covered by roots and broken stones. At first it looked like a collapsed stable. Then Kemp found a doorframe, not wooden, but steel, warped and rusted, but intact. The hinges were internal, the kind used to seal, not open. Bellen stepped forward and reached into his satchel. He pulled out a folded photograph, aged and torn at the edges, and held it beside the doorway. No one said anything. We all saw it. The arch, the markings, the discoloration above the door, where a symbol had once been scraped clean. It was the same place. He turned the photo around and showed us the back, a note in faded ink. Return to where silence was taught. His hand shook slightly, not from age or cold, but from something deeper, something that started years ago and hadn't stopped since. We worked in shifts to clear the debris. Shovels were useless against the rock, so we used crowbars and axes to pry away layers of mud and stone. By noon, we had cleared enough to reveal the full outline, a bunker entrance, angled downward, sealed with a wheel lock and covering warning stencils written in both German and French. That alone was a contradiction. Military signage didn't mix languages, unless it wasn't meant for soldiers. Bellen stepped forward and placed his hand on the lock. It turned with resistance, then gave way with a sigh of air that wasn't stale, but dry, too dry, as if the air inside had never mixed with the outside world. The door swung open without a sound. Inside, the corridor was narrow, lined with smooth concrete, and sloped gently down. Light came from nowhere, or perhaps the darkness was simply not complete. The floor was marked every 3 meters with brass studs. Bellen counted them aloud, softly, as we walked. 39, 42, 45. The corridor ended at a junction, left and right. We split. I went right with Kemp and another private whose name I don't remember anymore. Bellen, Faulkner, and the others went left. Our path led us to a large chamber filled with filing cabinets and a rusted projector on a tripod. Nothing else. No chairs. No this. Just storage and a screen bolted to the far wall. Kemp tugged open a drawer. Empty. Then another. Then another. All clean. Wiped as if they had never held anything. The projector still had a reel threaded. We checked the label. Blank. Just a strip of white tape, unreadable. I didn't want to turn it on, but Kemp did. The projector buzzed, light sputtered, and the reel began to turn. No image appeared, only that flickering white circle against the screen. But the room changed, or maybe it was just us. The air tasted metallic. A low hum began behind our ears, like something inside the skull, not outside it. The private behind me stepped back and knocked over a cabinet. The sound didn't echo, not even slightly. I looked down. The floor was wrong. Not tile, not concrete, but smooth like glass. Beneath it, I could see shadows. Not moving, waiting. The projector jammed. The reel snapped. The light died. We left that room quickly. At the junction, Bellin was waiting. He looked older, somehow, not in his face, but in his posture, like the hallway had aged him. He asked what we found. I told him. He didn't react, just nodded and turned toward the way we came. But we didn't go back. Instead, he knelt beside the floor at the junction and began to unscrew one of the brass studs. Beneath it, a hollow, a compartment, shallow and lined with lead. Inside, a journal, brittle and sealed in wax. No markings. He held it for a long time before speaking. He wrote this, he whispered. I know the binding. He always stitched the last page with copper thread. Said it kept the lies out. No one asked who he meant. We didn't need to. In the silence that followed, something behind the walls shifted. A tremor, maybe, or breath. Faulkner raised his rifle. Kemp lit another cigarette. The tunnel didn't move again. We returned to the surface as the day ended. The sun still hadn't appeared. Bellin placed a journal near the fire and watched the wax soften. Page by page, the heat revealed lines written in invisible ink. French, German, Latin, all mixed together. And between the words, symbols, not military, not mathematical, just shapes that made you feel watched. He didn't read aloud, just translated silently with his lips, eyes darting left and right, faster and faster. Then he stopped, closed the book, stood, and walked to the edge of the clearing. He's not gone, he said. He made a deal with the mountain. No one asked what that meant, because somewhere deep below us, the silence was still listening. The following morning brought a wind from the west, dry and sour, brushing the grass in tight circles around the clearing, as if something beneath had stirred in its sleep. We hadn't spoken much through the night. Bellin kept the journal close, tucked into the inner pocket of his coat, as though losing contact with it might break whatever thread had been drawn between us and what waited under the mountain. No one suggested we descend again, but no one packed to leave either. There was an unspoken recognition among us now that the place had not finished showing itself. Or perhaps it had only just begun. The trees to the east bent as if to whisper secrets they had held through decades of frost and silence. Bellin walked alone before the others stirred, down to the entrance we'd uncovered. The metal door now held open by frost-laced stones and fragments of past attempts to keep it closed. When we found him again, he was already 30 meters in, kneeling beside the wall and humming an old melody under his breath. One of those French chansons from before the war. He stopped when we approached and placed a gloved finger over his lips, then pointed. The wall ahead had changed. What was smooth, concrete before now bore lines, thin, hairline cracks that formed a pattern like veins or a root system. But they weren't structural. They weren't random either. I crouched beside Kemp and traced one with a gloved hand. Warm, not room temperature, warm. Bellin reached for his satchel and removed a faded transparency, a map overlay. He aligned it against the wall. Every line matched. The cracks were coordinates, but not for terrain, for sound. The realization passed to me like cold water. We weren't in a base. We were inside an instrument, a chamber designed to carry shape or perhaps trap vibrations. It would explain the lack of echo, the metallic taste in the air, the way certain words seemed heavier down here. Kemp cursed under his breath. Faulkner loaded a fresh round into his rifle without looking. We kept moving. The next passage had no markings, just steps, 37 in all, descending in a curve too precise to be natural. The air thickened, not with moisture but with pressure. Our ears popped one by one, and the world grew quieter with each step. I could hear my own pulse, could no longer hear the footsteps behind me. Bellin's voice, when he spoke, was audible only by watching the shape of his mouth. We stopped before a sealed door. No handle, no keyhole, only a panel with braille-like studs and a single etched line in French. So que couldn't any puvant mentor. Those who listen cannot lie. Bellin's jaw clenched. He raised his hand and pressed 3 studs in succession. The door opened inward with a sigh of air, like a breath held for decades. The chamber within was circular. Dome ceiling, floor of polished black tile, walls lined with ridged metal, resembling inside an old radio shell. In the center, a chair, not a throne, not a military seat, just a wooden chair, plain and splintered, bolted into a steel plate. On the far wall, a symbol, a spiral of jagged lines, interrupted at 2 points by scratches so violent the concrete around them had melted slightly. Bellin did not enter. None of us did, only stared. The silence in this room was different. Not a lack of sound, but a presence, a containment. Like everything we might say here would never escape. Kemp reached for his canteen and found it frozen solid. No one else moved. I stepped forward only because someone had to. 3 steps in, and my boots stopped making noise. 5 steps in, and I no longer heard my breathing. At the 7th, my own thoughts quieted, not gone, but slowed, drawn down like stones to still water. I placed a hand on the chair. The wood was warm. A heartbeat? I couldn't be sure. Then I saw it, on the underside of the seat, etched in blood or something too dark, an age and name. A. Just the initial. Bellin's eyes met mine. He nodded once. We left the chamber and closed the door. It sealed itself. Back at the fire, no one asked what happened. Bellin retrieved the journal again and turned to a page marked not with ink, but with a pinhole through the center. He held it above the flame, and as the heat rose, a message appeared. Not in code, not in symbols. Just one sentence, in the same hand from the back of the photo. I am still speaking, Claude. You are just afraid to listen. His face fell in shadow. The others turned away. But I saw something in his expression then. Not fear, not grief. Recognition. The mountain had not just buried something. It had given it a voice. We didn't sleep. Not truly. The fire crackled, but gave no warmth. Our bodies remained in place, wrapped in blankets and coats, but our minds wandered into the tunnels we had sealed behind us. Faulkner kept one eye open the whole night, his rifle across his knees. Kemp mumbled in his sleep, his lips forming names none of us recognized. Bellin sat with his back to the wall, the journal folded closed beside him. Whatever comfort it once gave him had waned. The lines on his face deepened. His breath came slower, and for the first time since we arrived, he looked older than 52. Looked like a man who'd walked too long beside silence, and knew it by name. At dawn, mist crawled up in the woods like fingers searching for something lost. The mountain stood still, indifferent to our presence. The path we'd come marked only by broken branches, and the faint imprint of tires already softened by dew. No one suggested turning back. That decision had stopped being ours. We had already followed the thread too far. Bellin led us east of the original entrance, past a collapsed observation post where rusted binoculars still hung on a bent tripod. The earth sloped downward here, the rocks more jagged, vegetation sparser. The birds had stopped singing. We found the second entry partially buried, a steel hatch almost flush with the ground, camouflaged with dead leaves and old canvas. Kemp kicked the edge, and it echoed, hollow, open. With some effort, we cleared it and descended. This tunnel was older, the air colder, the markings on the wall no longer sharp. The concrete wept mineral streaks, like veins turned outward. The silence returned in layers, not abrupt this time, but gradual, like walking into deep water. Our boots no longer made sound by the fifth bend. The path narrowed, then widened again, leading us into a chamber more refined than the others. No dust, no debris. Polished steel beams arched overhead, and recessed lights blinked faintly to life, powered by something not visible. Bellin froze mid-step and reached for the wall. A handprint, faint but real, left in soot or ash. Too small to be Faulkner's. Too fresh to be decades old. Kemp pointed. The floor ahead showed a trail, boots, slightly irregular, as if the person limped. They stopped at a door that had no handle, only a slot. Bellin approached, withdrew the journal again, and took out a small folded sheet from its cover. A letter, sealed in wax that had long since cracked. On the back, in looping cursive, Chamber Noir. He hesitated, then slid the letter into the slot. A pause followed. Then the door released, not inward or outward, but downward, sinking into floor without sound. The room beyond was lit by soft amber light, like dust caught in glass. It had no furniture, no corners, no windows. A dome of gold tiles, smooth and curved, surrounded us. In the center stood a pedestal, and upon it, a reel-to-reel recorder, silent, intact, loaded with a spool of tape. Belland approached with care. His hand hovered above the play switch for a moment before pressing it down. The voice that followed was not a recording in the usual sense. There was no introduction, no timestamp, no background static. Only a man's voice, calm, deliberate, reciting lines in French from an old play. Le silence est un abîme qu'on habite à deux. Silence is an abyss we inhabit together. Belland staggered back a step. The voice was Etienne's. I didn't need to ask. It wasn't just recognition. It was a return. A sound pulled from decades prior and locked in time. He let it play. The passage continued. Fragments from Molière, from obscure poems they had memorized as boys. It shifted between French and Latin, sometimes German, always returned to phrases about walls, sound, and memory. Then the tape slowed, warbled, ended. Belland remained still. The pedestal beneath the recorder lowered silently into floor, and in its place rose a new platform. A box, sealed in bronze, with no hinges. On its surface, a map, not of the mountain, but of something beneath it. Chambers we had not seen. Passages spiraling downward. At the center, a circle marked with the same symbol from before, the jagged spiral. Bézidit est une deep stroke, the phrase, les clés ne sont jamais des portes. The keys are never doors. Faulkner turned to me. We go back, he said. We bring this to command. But Belland shook his head. No, he said, his voice calm. They'll come with drills and questions and reasons. And they'll hear it too. What I heard. What I never should have heard again. He turned the map over. On its back was a fragment of sheet music. Handwritten. The same melody he had hummed earlier in the tunnel. The same one Etienne once played on piano after long winters in Lyon. None of us spoke on the way back. The hatch closed behind us with a finality that didn't require locks. The forest beyond had grown darker in hue, as though the mountain's shadow had lengthened. The voice still echoed somewhere behind Belland's eyes, and though he never said it out loud, we all knew something in him had changed when he heard it, and it wasn't done speaking yet. We waited 2 days before returning, not because of orders, not because of fear, but because Belland refused. He said the voice needed silence, that whatever it had been trying to say had not finished, and if we went back too soon, we'd hear only fragments again. During those 2 days, he barely spoke. He sat with a map constantly in front of him, tracing its lines not with pens or pencils, but with the edge of his nail. His eyes were red-rimmed, but not from lack of sleep. He seemed to drift in and out of something deeper than rest, something quieter. Faulkner grew restless. Kemp cleaned his rifle 3 times in a row and left the barrel cool. I busied myself writing reports no one would read. Outside, rain came and went in long, slow sheets, barely tapping the window panes. When the sun returned, it felt distant, like it belonged to another place entirely. On the morning of the 3rd day, Belland stood, folded the map precisely, and said, "Now!" No explanation, no plan, but we followed. The descent was shorter this time. The forest seemed to part for us, as if even the trees had begun to understand our path was not theirs. The hatch groaned open under our hands, and the same stale breath of the mountain greeted us. Down the ladder, through the corridor, past the door that opened not by code or command but memory. The domed room was empty again, the pedestal gone, the walls unchanged. We didn't linger. Belland traced a new path on the map, an eastern corridor previously dismissed as too narrow to lead anywhere. It did. The walls here had once been painted, but time had stripped them bare, leaving only outlines of symbols we didn't recognize. Not swastikas, not eagles, not Reich insignia. Symbols older than any regime, etched into the concrete, like veins forced through skin. We reached a chamber lower than any we had yet seen. The air shifted as we entered, not in temperature, but in pressure, like sound itself had weight. The lights here still worked, humming faintly to life as we passed. In the center stood a tall cabinet of wood and glass, untouched by dust. Inside, a series of spools, tapes, marked only with dates. Some from the 1940s, others from earlier, one from 1917, another from 1889. Belland opened the cabinet and selected a reel without hesitation. 1943. He loaded it into a nearby machine, one far older than the one from before, its parts mechanical, its switches worn smooth by human fingers. He pressed play. The voice was the same. Etienne, but younger, different cadence. He was reading an account, not literature, a report, descriptions of tests performed in chambers designed not to hold people, but to hold resonance. Frequencies that changed depending on who entered. Some heard voices. Others heard silence that pressed so hard against their skulls, they began to bleed from the nose. One subject tore his own ears off. Not to escape the sound, Etienne said, but to hold it inside. Kemp stepped away, muttering. Faulkner stayed, jaw set, hand on the butt of his pistol. Belland didn't blink. The tape continued, talk of failures, of adjustments. Then a phrase that made all of us lean forward. Transmission embedded in limestone. Impossible to trace. Not sent. Received. The voice stopped. Belland rewound it. Played it again. Received. Not transmitted. Not echoed. Heard. From below. Deeper than even this. The tape ended. He removed it, set it aside, and chose another, one unmarked. This one started with static, harsh and grating. Then a voice, not Etienne's. Female, Italian. Singing. A lullaby. Half a bar, broken, repeating. The melody seemed familiar and unfamiliar at once, like hearing your name in a dream. Belland's hand trembled. He turned off the machine. The song kept playing for 3 more seconds. We left the chamber. None of us spoke. The hallway felt tighter, the lights now blinking intermittently. The map's lines no longer matched. Some corridors had shifted. Doors had closed. Others had appeared. We walked slower. Kemp began muttering again, not in wah, not in anything we recognized. Belland touched his shoulder gently. It happens, he said. It passes. But his voice was wrong. Too calm, too prepared. We found a stairwell, spiral, rusted, descending into black. No light followed us down. Volkner Lieflach. The steps echoed, not with our steps, but a half second after, like something beneath us was learning our rhythm. The air thinned. Belland breathed harder, gripping the railing. At the bottom, a corridor slanted downward. The walls were no longer concrete. They were stone, ancient, marked with carvings dulled by centuries. A new language, one I swore I had seen once in a museum exhibit on pre-Roman cults. Kemp collapsed. Faulkner and I lifted him. Belland walked ahead. Alone, at the end of the hall, another door. This one wasn't metal. It was wood, blackened, charred at the edges. No handle, just the remnants of burnt symbols carved deep. Belland laid his hand against it, not to open, to listen. And for a moment, just one, his eyes closed and he smiled, a smile full of grief, memory, and some other emotion we couldn't name. Then he turned to us and said, "He's still speaking, but not to me anymore." Behind the door, the sound changed. Not words, not music. A heartbeat, not ours. Not one, many. We did not open it. Not yet. We didn't return to the charred door the next day, or the one after. Something about the pulse that came from beyond it, not heard, but felt, kept us tethered to the upper levels, pretending we still had duties to complete, records to catalog, corridors to measure. Even Belland, whose resolve had drawn us deeper than command would have ever approved, avoided the descent. Instead, he spent hours with the old tapes. Most of them were degraded. Hisses, hums, fragments of voices caught in what sounded like overlapping time. Once, a woman recited verses in Greek. Another tape contained what at first seemed like ordinary wartime orders, until a reverse playback revealed the same message repeated backwards, layered under the original voice. And in the gaps, those silences between recordings, there was the faintest trace of something else. Not words, something more primitive, like breath pressed through stone. On the third morning, Kemp's muttering stopped. He had spoken little since the episode in the limestone corridor. That day, he rose early, wrote a note none of us saw in place, and walked into the corridor leading east. His footsteps were silent. We only noticed he was gone when his pack remained untouched by the wall. Faulkner found the note wedged behind the stove, damp with condensation. It wasn't in German. It wasn't in French. It wasn't in any script we recognized, and yet Belland read it in silence, folding it precisely into his coat pocket. He went where he was called, he said, and no one asked what that meant. Later that afternoon, we returned to the char door. It hadn't changed. Still without handle, still scorched at the edges. Belland brought a heat lamp, and I recognized his intention before he explained it. If the notebook he found revealed ink only under heat, perhaps this door too concealed something. As the metal arm warmed, the symbols along the grain began to glow faintly, not like paint, but like embers reignited. The language was old, older than any we had seen, but Belland traced it like it was familiar, mouthing syllables under his breath. Not a door, he finally said. A seal. We debated whether to continue. The pulse had returned, slow but unmistakable. It vibrated through the soles of our boots. I felt in my jaw, like a low organ note held under the earth. Faulkner volunteered to guard the upper corridor. Belland and I remained. When the seal finally cracked, it didn't open outward or inward. It simply faded, though it lost its shape, curling like smoke, revealing a tunnel of stone steps curving sharply downward into black. We descended. The walls pulsed slightly with every step, as if the stone were breathing in tempo with the heart we had sensed. At a landing, a door, real, this time metallic and cold, stood open. Inside, rows of notebooks lined the shelves. Thousands, each carefully labeled with dates ranging back over a century. Some were written in languages long dead, others in invented codes, ciphers, or pictograms. Belland opened one and exhaled sharply. It's his, he said. Etienne, not a journal, but transcripts of voices, replayed and transcribed over decades. Names attached, some marked as unknown, others familiar, scientists, officers, even civilians. Each entry listed a time, a tone, a phrase, and always a temperature. The voices didn't just respond to heat. They required it, as if the stone remembered only when warm. Belland grew pale as he flipped further. One entry bore my name, dated 3 days ago. The phrase, "Don't stop walking." He closed a notebook, placed it back carefully, and refused to meet my eyes. We left the archive room and followed the tunnel until it opened into a vast chamber with a vaulted ceiling held up by blackened ribs of steel. At the far end, a console, rusted but active, glowed with a dim orange light. Above it, an array of spools, far larger than the tapes from earlier, turned slowly in sequence, as if still recording. Belland approached. A microphone protruded from the console's base. He stared at it for a long time before pressing the button and speaking 4 words. Etienne, I'm still here. No reply. He pressed again. I kept my word. The spool stopped. A new light flickered to life, green, then red. A hum built in the chamber, not mechanical, but organic, like a cello string tightening. Then the microphone crackled, not with a voice, but with static arranged in a pattern, as though something tried to simulate breath. Then words, brittle and cracked. Still here, still warm. Belland staggered back. His hand went to his chest, where the letter remained. The tape began to rewind itself, faster than any machine should allow. The hum intensified. I stepped forward, unsure where to stop the machine or pull him back. Before I could decide, the floor beneath the console began to glow, not with electricity, with heat. Red veins pulsed outward, reaching for our boots. Belland looked at me and nodded. We've reached the core. We didn't speak for long minutes after the console shut itself down. The light receded from the floor, and the veins of heat vanished like breath on glass. Belland stood unmoving, his eyes locked on the spot where the words had emerged, as if waiting for more. But there was only silence again, thick and unmoving. I checked the reels still intact, but now unwinding slowly in reverse. Not playing back, not recording. Erasing. Whatever had spoken didn't want to be remembered. Bellin stepped back, and I could hear his breath had grown shallow. Not panic, resigned. Like something inside him had crossed a point of no return. He looked older then, not in years, but in weight. Like he had been carrying someone else's silence all along, and now it had returned to him. We left the chamber in silence. The tunnel back was darker than we remembered. The lights along the path flickered less regularly, and at times the blackness pressed so tight around us that it felt like the corridor was narrowing. We walked faster. Once, I looked back and saw a shadow where there should have been none, shaped like a man standing still. Long after we had passed, I said nothing. Bellin didn't look back. Faulkner met us at the junction near the archive room, pale and seated on the ground with his rifle across his knees. "Something passed this way," he said. His voice was dry. I didn't see it, but it made my radio crackle. Just for a second. Bellin nodded and told him we were heading back to the surface. Faulkner didn't move. I offered to help him stand, but he refused. "I'll wait a little longer," he said, just to be sure. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't scared. He was listening. We climbed the spiral out of the sealed level, the air growing colder as we rose. The moment we stepped past the remnants of the vanished door, a wave of stillness pressed down on us. Not peace, suspension. Like something beneath had closed its eyes again, and we had escaped before it noticed. Above, the barracks were empty. The others were gone, not evacuated, just absent. Their gear was still there, boots beside bunks, packs leaning against walls, notebooks left open on tables. One chair still rocked faintly, as if someone had left it seconds before. Bellin didn't comment. He went to his cot, removed a letter from his coat, and unfolded it once more. I watched as he scanned the lines with the same quiet obsession I had seen in the tunnel. Then he turned to me. The voice. It wasn't just Etienne. It was what remained of him, what this place did to him. He chose to stay, but not because he was ordered, because he was afraid of what would happen if it got out. I didn't ask what he meant. We both already knew. The notebooks, the tones, the temperatures, none of it was archive. It was containment. Recording was their method of keeping the voices anchored, and now the tapes were erasing themselves. We debated staying to warn command, but the radios no longer worked. Our location wasn't marked. The entrance we'd used had begun to seal with frost again, stones shifting in unnatural silence. Bellin said it wouldn't open twice. That night, I dreamed of Etienne's voice reading lines from the same play we had heard from the console. But in the dream, the lines were wrong. Bent, twisted, missing vowels and meaning, as if spoken underwater. When I woke, Bellin was gone. I found him hours later in the relay chamber. The floor had cooled, but the console glowed faintly. He was seated on the edge of the pit, holding the microphone, whispering in French. The words were soft, not meant to be understood. A goodbye, maybe, or a promise. I waited. When he finished, he stood, turned to me and said, "It doesn't end here, but it needs to sleep again." He handed me his journal, already sealed and labeled, and pointed to the upper stair. "Take it. Burn it if you must. Just don't let anyone build another archive." I hesitated. I didn't want to leave him there, but he had already stepped beyond the threshold of that role. This wasn't about war anymore. It was about memory, about a kind of echo that didn't need a voice to travel. Bellin turned back toward the console and sat beside it. His back was straight, shoulders squared. He didn't look afraid. When I left, the entrance collapsed behind me. I don't know how, but I didn't stop walking. I kept walking north until the snow began to thin and the rocks took on the red hue of the Surat stone again. Days blurred without measure. I had left behind my watch, my maps, even the canteen, everything that seemed to carry weight from that place. Only the journal remained, wrapped in waxcloth and tucked under my coat, close to my chest. I avoided villages and outposts, choosing the long paths between. I didn't want to be found yet, didn't want to speak. Every sound still echoed with the dry cadence of a voice that had no throat. At night, I slept under trees or in abandoned stalls, waking often to the same silence I had left behind. Not peace, but interruption. A stillness that felt watched. I reached a Red Cross post near Orvieto on the 7th day. At least, that's what the medic told me after I collapsed near the southern fence. They took me in without questions, treating frostbite on my fingers and a deep laceration on my shoulder I hadn't remembered receiving. The nurse who changed my bandages said it looked older than a week, more like a burn that never opened, only folded inward. I didn't respond. They didn't press. War makes its own explanations. I gave a false name, not for deception, but because the real one felt heavy, misused. Claude Bellin had remained in that relay chamber. Whoever walked away was someone stitched together by footsteps alone. After 2 weeks, I was moved to a repatriation camp in Bastia Umbra. They were sorting Allied personnel for return to their commands, or what remained of them. I was processed as an auxiliary. No rank, no file. Just a tag and a silence that made the officers shift their eyes. One asked where I had served. I said Surat. He frowned and asked again. No operations near Surat, he said. Just a weather station bombed out in 44. I nodded. Let him believe the maps. Let him think war had erased everything. Some places erased themselves. That night, I opened the journal. Not to read, but to check if it was still intact. The pages had begun to darken near the spine, the ink bleeding faintly through fibers as if the words wanted to vanish or spread. I recognized Etienne's handwriting on the inner margin, notations, fragments, phonetic codes written like stage directions. One line read, "Echo is not memory. Echo is permission." Another said, "To transmit is to divide." Beneath that, the same symbol carved into the chamber wall. 2 interlocked spirals, one pointing inward, the other out. I had seen it once in a book Etienne kept in university, long before the war. A symbol of recursion, of returns without end. They offered me passage back to France 2 days later. I refused. I said I had family near Florence. Another lie, but not one that would raise suspicion. Italy had become a country of ghosts and orphans. Nobody questioned a man without roots. I took the journal and walked east instead, away from the camps and the rail lines, toward the hills where the signals grew thin and the sky forgot to speak. I didn't know what I was searching for. Maybe an answer, maybe just distance. I ended up near a convent once used by partisans, abandoned but still intact. The bell tower had collapsed, but the refectory still held shelves of canned goods and candles. I made a room of it. The walls were thick, the air dry, and most of all it was quiet, truly quiet, not the oppressive void of the tunnels, but the quiet of absence. I spent hours copying the journal by hand into a separate notebook. Not everything, only the fragments that didn't shift when I read them. Some entries moved, the ink rearranged, or the margins expanded as if resisting the eye. Those I burned. One morning, weeks later, I heard the low drone of aircraft far off. A supply run, or maybe reconnaissance. It didn't matter. The sky above, Surat had gone quiet again. That was what mattered. I didn't know if Bellin was still alive, or if the chamber had taken him the way it had taken Etienne. But I knew the relay had stopped. That whatever signal had been trapped there had found no new listener. For now, I buried the journal near the convent's threshold, beneath a stone marked with a spiral. Not a grave, a warning. I left a single page in my coat, folded and sealed with instructions. If you find this, do not return. If you hear the voice, do not answer. If you must listen, never record. I stayed 1 more week. On the last night, I dreamed of a corridor made of light, not stone. Bellin stood at the end, his back to me, reading aloud. The words were not French, not Latin, just tone, rising, falling, measuring the world like a pulse. When I awoke, the bells of the convent, long silent, rang once. No wind, no hands, just one clear note before silence took hold again. The final road brought me south again, though I never planned it. I avoided the valleys and cities, staying to the ridgelines and narrow tracks, where only deer and forgotten trails remained. The journal stayed buried, the copy hidden inside the lining of my coat, stitched with coarse thread I'd found in an old field hospital's drawer. At night, I thought less about the voice and more about the silence between its syllables. I began to suspect that silence had always been the message, not the words, not HN, not the war, just the void learning how to mimic sound. I crossed into Lazio under a full moon. The fields were dry, broken by vineyards and scars of old trenches. I passed a village whose name had been scrubbed from every sign, whose windows had no glass, only curtains that moved without wind. I didn't stop. My legs carried me through instinct, the way a soldier moves long after orders cease. Somewhere near Civita Castellana, I saw it again. Mani Surat, not looming this time, but still a presence on the edge of the horizon, quiet like a closed eye. I told myself I wouldn't return, but my feet didn't listen. They followed the sound that no longer played, the absence that still shaped the air. I reached the northern ridge by dusk. No soldiers, no fences, just brush reclaiming the trail and stones that remembered boots better than names. The tunnel entrance was sealed, not collapsed, sealed. Vuelli Platz reinforced concrete, no seams, like it had never opened. I stood before it with nothing in my hands, no tools, no lantern, just a memory of a door that had once listened and answered. I pressed my palm to the surface. It was cold, but not lifeless. The same way a river beneath ice still moved. I waited, but nothing stirred. No vibración, no hecho. It was not invitation. It was warning. I walked the perimeter until I found a spot where Etienne's voice had last reached me. Nothing marked it now. The soil was level, the stones undisturbed. I dug with bare hands, unsure what I expected to find. Bone, guide, tape, nothing surfaced. Only earth, as if the land had learned to close its own wounds. I sat there until night, stars above, not speaking. For the first time, I allowed myself to open the page I had saved. The final message Bellin had transcribed before sealing the relay. The handwriting was faint, but still legible. We are not echoes. We are what silence leaves behind. I read it once, then again, then folded it and burned it in the shell of my hand. I descended from the mountain slowly, not because I was tired, but because I knew it would be the last time. Surat would forget me, the way it had forgotten its chambers, its maps, its war, and that forgetting was mercy. I reached the same convent weeks later. The stone I'd marked was untouched, but the soil had shifted, as if something beneath had breathed once. I didn't dig. I didn't need to. The journal no longer mattered. Its message had already passed through me. I left it sealed beneath the threshold and locked the doors behind me. By spring, I was living near Tivoli, under the name Henri Lamart. I taught French to children whose parents worked the vineyards, who had never heard of Surat or its tunnels. I grew tomatoes. I drank coffee from enamel cups that remembered other winters. I aged quietly. I spoke only when necessary. When I walked, I listened, not to voices, but to spaces between them. That's how I knew when it happened. The first time was during a festival. Music, laughter, bells. Then a gap, not a pause. A gap, the kind that pulls your eyes to the horizon, the kind that arrives before sound. I turned my head, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I heard a voice I knew. Etienne, or Bellin, or something they had carried. But it passed. The second time was in my sleep. I dreamed the chamber again, not how it had been, but how it might become, filled with people listening, not in fear, in reverence, as if the silence had become sacred, as if someone had taught it to speak without harm. I woke with tears on my face, not of grief, of completion. I never returned to France. The war ended. Names changed. Files disappeared. But I remained, in a country that remembered better in stones than in books. On my last walk, I followed a path that led nowhere, a hill above the vineyards, a place where the wind didn't echo. I stood there until dusk, then sat down and closed my eyes. I didn't expect light. I didn't expect voice. only the stillness that lives at the end of sound, the place where memory breathes once before falling silent again. They told me it would be simple, a routine assessment. 1 week, maybe 2, patch a ventilation shaft, run some soil stability checks, write the dam report, and go home. They didn't even bother to fly me in directly. They left me at a railway junction 40 kilometers east, where an old truck was waiting, no insignia, no driver ID, no questions. Just a nod and an engine that didn't like the cold. The road wasn't paved. Not really. More like a memory of one. Every few kilometers, we passed what looked like abandoned checkpoints, their signs rusted and half covered in moss, their barriers warped or missing entirely. No one stopped us. The further we went, the more it felt like we weren't entering a site. We were leaving the world behind. The driver didn't speak. He only looked ahead, hands tight on the wheel, as if the forest might change direction if he blinked. I asked twice what his name was. He never answered. The third time, he just turned the radio on. Nothing but static at first. Then a voice, not in any language I recognized, faded in and out like it was fighting to stay real. He didn't change the station. He just turned it up slightly and kept driving. We arrived near dusk. The compound was surrounded by fencing that hadn't been repaired in years. One of the gates was open, crooked. Inside, the building stood like forgotten teeth concrete, stained, sagging at the edges. My quarters were marked E3, in black paint over an older German stencil I couldn't quite make out. Inside was a cot, a desk, and a heater that breathed like an old man dying in his sleep. No one greeted me. No instructions on the door. Just a folder left on the desk. The seal had already been broken. Inside, there were maps, too clean, too recent, and a single type page. Primary objective: assess and report on structural instability of shaft 12A. Secondary objective: document unexplained subsidence events in quadrants D through F. Further access pending clearance. Do not engage with unauthorized personnel. There was no signature, no contact name, just a date 2 months old. Below it, someone had scribbled something in pencil, then erased it too roughly to read. That night, I tried to sleep, but the wind found holes in every corner of the room. It whistled through the heater's frame and made the walls creak like they had old stories to share, but no voice to tell them. Around midnight, I thought I heard something metallic, a dragging sound, followed by a series of soft thuds. When I opened the door, there was nothing, just a compound, motionless under the moonlight and the faint scent of ash in the air. No fire, no smoke, just that memory of something burnt long ago. I stayed awake until light returned. The next morning, I met the others. There were 4 of them, 2 engineers, 1 logistics officer, and a medic who refused to remove her gloves even indoors. No one used first names. We wore old uniforms without patches. They spoke in clipped sentences. All business. No one asked why I was there. They already knew, or pretended to. We briefed in a former operations bunker, now filled with portable lights and damp paper maps pinned to the corkboard like a war no one remembered fighting. Shaft 12A, I was told, had been sealed since 1954. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was a relic of wartime overreach. An unfinished tunnel project buried beneath what used to be a munitions plant. But recent tremors had opened parts of it again. Soil was collapsing. Local wildlife patterns had changed. A civilian hiker went missing near the ridge last winter, and a rescue team never found his body, only his coat, folded neatly on a rock that hadn't been exposed in decades. I asked why it was buried in the first place. The logistics officer said it wasn't. When I asked what he meant, he just pointed at the maps and said, "You'll see." We set out that afternoon. The path to Shaft 12A was overgrown, marked only by half-collapsed waypoints and spray-painted markers in orange and blue. No GPS. No satellite coverage. Too close to the mountain's core. They said, like the stone itself could interfere. The tunnel entrance was barely visible from the ridge, half buried under soil and vines. Its metal frame twisted like it had been melted and frozen in the same breath. The concrete retaining wall had split in 2. Roots grew between the cracks like veins in a dead body. We cleared debris slowly, cutting through branches that had no business growing in winter. Behind it, the gate was still sealed, welded shut, according to the reports. But when we arrived, it was open. Not recently, either. The hinges were rusted in the open position. No tool marks. No sign of forced entry. Just an open mouth in the rock. Waiting. We argued about going in. The medic wanted to wait for external clearance. The others didn't. It's already been breached, one of the engineers said. Whatever's down there, someone's seen it before. I said nothing. I just looked at the entrance and thought of the erased note in my folder. We descended with headlamps, portable lanterns, and 2 radios, both of which failed the moment we passed the threshold. There was no collapse, no sudden drop in temperature, just silence. Total, oppressive silence that made your own breath feel like an intrusion. And then something stranger. Despite the depth, despite the rock, the soil inside had been disturbed. Recently, like someone had tried to dig their way out. Not in. I crouched to touch it. Still loose. Not frozen. Not compacted. And beneath the first layer, I found something odd. 3 vertical lines scratched into the concrete, just deep enough to catch dust in time. The soil hadn't broken on its own. Someone had broken it. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there anymore. I stood, slowly, and realized I was holding my breath. The light from the entrance no longer reached us. And the silence, somehow, was no longer empty. The walls were too smooth. That was the first thing I noticed. Not smooth like erosion or concrete polish. Smooth like intention. Someone had cared about the texture of these tunnels. And that disturbed me more than the silence. Nature decays. War ruins. But this place was preserved. Not like a ruin, like a secret. We moved in a straight line for almost 30 meters. Then the tunnel forked. The map said it shouldn't. In fact, according to the folder they gave me, this section shouldn't even exist. The seal gate was supposed to be the end of the line, a wall behind which nothing had been completed. But here we were, standing in a split corridor, lit only by the dim arc of our headlamps and a flickering heat lantern mounted on a logistics officer's belt. One path led upward, the other dipped into a curve. Without speaking, we chose the descent. The slope wasn't steep, but it felt deliberate, like whoever built it wanted people to walk this way slowly, step by step, as if descending into memory instead of architecture. After 12 paces, the air changed. Not colder, not thicker, just older. The kind of air that hadn't moved in years. The kind of air that remembered voices. I heard none, but I could feel them, like the echo of breath on the back of your neck when no one's behind you. The engineers were starting to whisper to each other, but their words didn't carry. Even at arm's length, their voices sounded like they were behind glass. I asked for a status check. The response came seconds late, like the sound had to navigate the walls. Then the medic said something that none of us had considered. Why is there no dust? She was right. The floor was clean. The walls had no buildup. Even our footprints looked temporary, like the concrete was trying to erase them as soon as we passed. I shined my light into a ventilation shaft near the ceiling, newer than the rest, almost surgical in its cuts, and saw nothing but shadow. No animals. No insects. Not even the whisper of mold. Something was maintaining this place. And it wasn't time. We came upon the first chamber shortly after. It wasn't marked. No doors. Just an opening in the wall wide enough to admit one person at a time. Inside, the walls were lined with chalk markings, circles, triangles, sets of numbers not in any recognized sequence. One engineer said it looked like blast radius math. The other said radio compression ratios. But I'd seen markings like this once before at a site north of Cannes, where a transmission bunker had been repurposed for something it was never designed to hold. That one had been destroyed in '45, buried beneath 15 meters of reinforced concrete and classified as resolved. I didn't tell them that. I just copied the sequence into my field book and moved on. We reached a secondary corridor that looped back toward the surface, but none of us wanted to go up. Not because of fear, because it felt wrong, like a backward step. So we pressed deeper. That's when we found the inscription. carved not into the wall, but into the pipe that ran the length of the passage, just above shoulder height. The words were in French, which only I understood. They were shallow, written in erratic strokes as if done with a dull instrument. Il n'y a pas de sortie ici, seulement le souvenir. There is no exit here, only memory. I didn't translate aloud. I just stared at it until one of the engineers tapped my shoulder. You okay? I nodded and said we should keep moving, but my hand was already in my coat pocket, closing around the photograph I had carried since they first assigned me to this place. We emerged into a circular room with no corners. Everything about it was wrong. The acoustics were dead, like the walls swallowed noise instead of bouncing it. We tested it by dropping a metal bolt. It hit the floor without a single echo, like it had fallen into cloth. At the center stood a pedestal, metal, square, and empty. No plaques, no terminals, just scarring on the surface, like something had been removed with force. Behind it, a staircase descended further, and something in my stomach twisted. One of the engineers went pale. The medic pulled off her gloves, finally, and rubbed her palms like she was trying to remember what touch was. None of us wanted to say what we were all thinking. This was not a storage site. This wasn't military infrastructure. It wasn't even historical. It was something else, designed not to be used but to be found. And now that we had, it felt like the structure itself was deciding what happened next. As we moved toward the stairs, a sound passed above us. Just once, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the vent. It was too fast to track, too light to be footsteps, but it moved with purpose. Not aimless, not drifting. It went somewhere, and that meant it came from somewhere. The logistics officer raised his radio again. Still dead. Batteries fully charged. We tried the backup. Nothing. The medic suggested returning. One engineer agreed. The other hesitated. I didn't. I said we would follow the staircase down. And if we found a dead end, so be it. But if we turned back now, we'd never come this far again. None of us would agree to return. And I needed to see what lay beneath. Not for the mission. Not even for the report. For Etienne. We descended in silence, one step at a time, with the kind of caution reserved for cliffs and confessions. At the base, we found something that shouldn't have existed. A corridor with doors. Real doors. Wooden reinforced, numbered in faded black paint. 2B, 2C, 2D, but no 2A. I walked slowly past each one, running my hand along the metal handles. They were cold, not with temperature, but with intent, like they hadn't been touched in decades, yet never forgot the last time they were. One door was ajar. 2D. I pushed it open and shone my light inside. There was nothing, just a room, maybe 3 meters square, with padded walls and a single chair bolted to the floor. A chain lay coiled at its base, clean. Too clean. I closed the door and stepped back. Someone said my name. Not loudly, not panicked, just spoken calmly, as if in greeting. But no one was near me. I turned. The others were behind, still near the stairwell. The medic looked at me like I'd gone pale. I asked, "Did you hear that?" She said no. The engineer said no. But I knew what I heard. It was Etienne's voice. Not from memory. From the room that had no dust. And no lock. The silence after I heard his voice wasn't just absence. It was a wait. I stood motionless before the door marked 2D, hand still hovering near the frame, unsure if I'd imagined it or if someone had truly reached across time and breath to speak from the dark. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The feeling that settled into my chest wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. I had heard Etienne's voice before. Not in dreams, not in trauma, but on a stage 27 years ago, in a drafty line theater where we first read "An Attendant Godot" aloud to a room of disinterested peers. The line I'd heard wasn't even his. It had been mine once, but his voice had said it. Perfect, measured, real. I turned away and walked back to the group, who said nothing at first. The medic touched my sleeve gently, the way people do when they want to ask something without opening their mouths. I nodded once. We moved forward. The corridor ended in another turn. This time to the left, toward a section that had been sealed, if the notes were to be believed. But again, the maps were wrong. The walls weren't caved in or closed off. They simply stopped, replaced by a newer material, something gray, porous, and acoustically strange. Our light seemed to dim against it, absorbed rather than reflected. The engineer ran a hand across it and pulled back, muttering. It was warm, not like an engine or fire, more like skin that had been in the sun. That was when I noticed a smell, not rot, not mildew, but ink, the way old ink smells when warmed under a desk lamp. Letters lifting off the page as if remembering themselves. The wall ahead of us wasn't meant to block. It was meant to preserve. We pushed forward. The passage narrowed slightly, just enough to force us into a single file. The sound of our boots dulled further with each step, until we might have been walking in socks. The walls here bore no markings, no numbers, no doors, but every few meters, a vent, small, circular, slitted. No air moved through them, and yet we could hear faint mechanical clicks from within, as though something waited, timing us. Then came the cold spot, not a drop in temperature across the space, but a very specific void, a 10-foot length of hallway where even breath felt wrong. The medic nearly turned back. The engineer stopped speaking. I walked through it first, not out of bravery, but out of inevitability. The notebook in my coat pocket, the one I hadn't opened since Paris, felt heavier. I pulled it out when we passed the threshold and flipped to the middle. The pages were blank. At least, they seemed blank. But when I brought it near my lantern, faint letters began to shimmer into view. Not ink, chemical burns, maybe messages written with heat-sensitive compounds, or some compound I didn't recognize. The first words were fragmented, but enough remained to tell me I wasn't the first to read them. If you feel warmth, it's listening. If you hear silence, it's close. I didn't show the others. I simply returned the notebook to my pocket and moved on, heartbeat rising. The next chamber we entered was round again, like the first, but this one had a ceiling twice as high, and at the center, hanging from an iron hook, was a microphone, an old ribbon model, the kind used in wartime radio broadcasts, suspended with care, its cable trailing into the ceiling and vanishing into a rusted conduit. No dust, no corrosion, just a microphone waiting. The engineer stepped forward and whispered something into it. The sound didn't transmit. It didn't echo. It vanished. Then came the sound, not from the walls, not from the vent, but from the floor. A low thrum, not a hum, but vibration, beneath the concrete, beneath us. The microphone had awoken something, and before we could argue or analyze, it spoke back, not in words, not even in language, but in tone, two notes, flat and rising, like a machine testing its voice. The engineer stepped back immediately. The medic began to pray under her breath, not in Latin or Wa, but something Slavic. I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the mic. Even as it swayed gently now, no breeze to move it, no current to feed it, just the echo of a voice that wasn't ours, responding to presence with memory. I reached into my coat again, pulling out the photograph. Etienne's face looked up at me, still worn, still smudged at the edges. I flipped it over. Where once there had been nothing, now faint ink shimmered. A quote from Molière, one we used to say before performances. Ce n'est pas l'acte qui compte, mais l'intention derrière le rideau. It is not the act that matters, but the intent behind the curtain. I folded it once and returned it to my coat. The engineer said we should disconnect the mic. I disagreed. This wasn't a device. It was a threshold. Something was inviting us to listen, not speak. I stepped beneath it, stared up at the old ribbon, and whispered Etienne's name. The response wasn't immediate, but it came from behind us. The corridor we'd passed through, a footstep, then another, measured, deliberate, not echoes, not repetition. Someone or something was following the route we had just walked, and it was close. We turned off the lanterns, not out of strategy, but instinct. Darkness returned like a blanket, and yet, through the absence of light, I could still feel the microphone above me, still hear the soft click of some mechanism deep in the walls, still smell the ink. Whatever followed us wasn't running. It didn't need to. It had time. We were the ones trespassing on memory. The corridor ahead now glowed faintly, not with light, but with residual warmth, as if our passage had left fingerprints that refused to fade. We moved forward, slowly, every sense pulled taut. The final vent at the end of the hall was different, wider, circular, and from it came a sound that broke every law of acoustics. A breath. Not wind, not air. A breath. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. I looked back. No one behind us. But the breath continued, and it was getting closer. The breath continued even after we passed the last vent, as if it had no source, no throat, just a rhythm trapped in the walls. We didn't speak. No one asked what it was or tried to explain it. Some things, when named, become real, and we weren't ready for that yet. The corridor ahead narrowed again, this time more severely, until our shoulders brushed the sides. The ceiling dipped, forcing us to duck. It felt like descending into a vein. The concrete here was smooth, seamless, poured in one continuous motion with no seams or tool marks. Our boots no longer made sound. Even our own breathing began to feel stolen, like the place was deciding how much air we deserved. The medic stumbled once, but caught herself on the wall, and when she pulled her hand back, her fingers were clean, too clean. I looked closer. No dust, no debris, not even oil marks on the machines that had surely built this place. It was like walking into a photograph, perfectly preserved but stripped of time. We reached a point where the corridor split. Left or right, no markers, no symbols. The group hesitated, waiting for someone to decide. I turned left, not by reason but by feel. The others followed without question. The air grew warmer, slightly metallic. We passed what looked like an old fuse box set into the wall. When I opened it, there were no wires, just a glass slide, the kind used in microscopes, glowing faintly. I closed it quickly. That warmth wasn't natural. It pressed behind my eyes like pressure before a storm. The passage opened into a new chamber, rectangular, lined with glass panels on both sides. Inside those panels, we expected to see equipment, perhaps weapons, maybe maps. But what filled the spaces was far more disturbing. They were rooms. Tiny, self-contained rooms, each no larger than a phone booth. Inside each one a chair. And on each chair, a pair of headphones positioned with surgical precision. The cords vanished into the walls behind them. No dust, no decay. One booth contained a coat neatly folded. Another had an old German canteen. But no people, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had been used, emptied, and resealed. The engineer tapped the glass. No sound. He tried again, harder. Still nothing. It was thicker than normal, maybe reinforced. Or maybe something else. In the center of the chamber, a metal table stood beneath a surgical lamp, and on the table, a binder. No cover, just yellowed pages, still intact. I opened it. The text was in German, but not standard technical jargon. It was poetic, almost. The voice does not belong to the body. The body only hosts it. If you remove the host, the voice seeks a new shell. Page after page of notes that read more like philosophy than science. But toward the end, a list of names. French, British, Polish. One name had a red mark beside it. HNR. The same surname as my friend. The same mark I'd seen in the margins of his letters years ago. A cipher we'd invented in school. I ran my finger beneath it, trying to steady my breath. The room had grown hotter. Not stifling, but electric, like standing beside a power station. I could feel the metal through my boots, humming at a frequency my bones didn't like. We decided to continue. The corridor beyond the glass room had a door at the end. Heavy iron, painted gray. No handle, just a slit near the center, perhaps for identification, or perhaps something else. I pressed my face near it and peered through. Darkness. But when I exhaled, my breath fogged the slit and revealed fingerprints. Dozens of them, as if someone on the other side had once pressed back, desperate. The engineer rigged a tool from his belt and pried at the edge. It didn't budge. Then, Without warning, it clicked. Not from the tool, but from within. A release mechanism. The door opened inward, revealing a stairwell. Narrow, steep, descending in tight circles. The walls here were different, damp. The smell of mold returned. We lit another lantern and began to descend. The sound of the breath faded, but something else replaced it. Not footsteps, not whispers. It was static, the kind you'd hear on a shortwave radio, drifting in and out of signal. Halfway down, we stopped. On the landing, a reel-to-reel recorder sat abandoned on a crate, still plugged into the wall. But there was no power. I turned the dial. Nothing. The engineer inspected it, said the wires were intact. I asked if we could take the tape. He nodded. We pocketed it, unsure why it was there, but certain it was meant to be heard. The stairs ended at a metal grate. Beyond it, more tunnel, but older. Cracked stone, not concrete. Roman, maybe, or older. The air was colder again. The medic lit incense from her pouch and whispered something under her breath. Her hands were shaking. The scent masked the mildew, but not the fear. We stepped through the grate and into a corridor that sloped gently downward. A slow descent, like being led into a forgotten cellar where no one had ever stored wine. The walls had carvings, faded, shallow, and unfamiliar. Not letters. Symbols. Spirals. Broken circles. An eye. The same eye from the diagram on the back of Etienne's final letter. The realization slowed my steps. These weren't just passages. They were part of something larger. A map, a sequence, or worse, an organ. The base itself might have been built on something older, something designed not for weapons, but for silence, to capture sound, to trap voice. We moved as one now, no longer questioning direction, just moving. The stone grew darker with each step. The floor became damp. The breath was gone, the static softer, but we were not alone. I felt in my skin, in my teeth, like something was waiting, not just for us, but for someone specific, and I had brought it with me. The corridor turned without warning, its curve sharp and unnatural, forcing us into single file. The walls had changed again, not in color or shape, but in texture. Where before there had been carved stone or poured concrete, now the surface felt porous, like dry skin stretched over bone. The lantern flickered with each step, as if the air resisted flame. We were deeper than any map had ever shown, yet no one spoke of turning back. The farther we walked, the less we remembered what light looked like behind us. Something ahead compelled us forward, not through fear, but familiarity, as if we were not discovering but returning. The path narrowed again before opening into a chamber, circular, domed, with no visible ceiling. The echo of our footsteps died the moment we crossed the threshold. There was no reverb, no sound at all, not even the softest of breath. The medic mouthed something, perhaps a prayer, but her voice never reached the air. I tried the same. Nothing. The silence was not absence, it was removal. It devoured everything. At the center stood a pedestal, waist high, carved from the same material as the walls. Upon it rested a mirror, small, handheld, but framed in iron so old it had turned black. I lifted it. The glass was clear, but offered no reflection. I tilted it toward the others. Still blank. The engineer gestured, pointing toward the base of the pedestal. There, carved into stone with delicate precision, was a name. Etienne René Belland. My father's name. My friend's name. Etched twice, once in French, and again below in Roman script, but reversed as if meant to be read from within. I stared at it until the letters blurred. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. This place had known him, or he had known it. The mirror grew warm in my hand. I set it down. Behind a pedestal, a recess in the wall revealed a niche, a shelf perhaps, or an altar. Upon it, another tape recorder. This one bore no label, no markings, but a thin coil of wire trailed from it into the stone wall, disappearing between seams. The engineer turned the knob. Static. Then, faintly, a voice. French. Male. Clear, but aged. My hands tightened. I recognized the cadence before the words. Etienne, not from memory, but from the way he read Racine in the theater, from the breath he caught between lines. The same pause before tragedy. The voice recited lines not from a military log, but from a play, Andromaque, the same script we had performed at university, a monologue he had always favored, one he claimed he would someday deliver with ash in his beard and snow on his shoulders. The words echoed only in the machine. The room remained silent. I pressed my fingers to my chest, trying to find my own heartbeat. It was there, but distant, as if it too were listening, straining to believe. The medic opened her pack and retrieved a thermos, offered it wordlessly to me. I drank without tasting. The warmth returned some sensation to my hands. We remained in that room longer than we should have. The engineer tried the walls for panels, seams, or signs of mechanisms. None. The room had one door, ours, and it hadn't closed behind us, but it felt like it had. I noticed the dust on our boots had vanished. Our lantern burned steady now, without flicker. The air no longer felt heavy, just empty. When we finally moved on, none of us looked back, not out of courage, but because there was nothing left to see. The mirror remained blank. The recorder still hummed, but without voice. The tunnel beyond curved again, descending. The incline was too gradual to mark, but our knees felt it. A dampness clung to the walls, and a soft smell, like old oil and metal filings, began to rise. The engineer muttered about generators, but no sound accompanied descent. We passed alcoves, small windowless doors, all sealed. On one, a symbol, not German, not Latin, a spiral, identical to the one etched into Etienne's old notebook. The notebook that had led me here, long after I stopped believing he was alive. I placed my hand on the spiral. The metal was warm, almost alive. The door didn't open. It didn't need to. The gesture alone was enough. I had become part of the mechanism. Ahead, another chamber awaited, this one rectangular, lined with shelving on both sides. Binders, diagrams, photographic slides. The language shifted from German to Latin, then to symbols none of us recognized. But in one binder, a page folded twice and sealed with wax. The insignia on the seal was not military. It was personal. A single line of text beneath it. Vox retenit est, the voice is retained. I broke the seal. The page was blank, until I breathed on it. Then lines appeared, not ink, but some chemical reacting to warmth. A floor plan. This floor, this room, and beneath it, another. An annotation marked it. Cavia, the Latin word for the seating in a theater, or for a cage. The engineer pressed his hand to the floor, nodding, hollow beneath. The medic looked at me. Her expression wasn't fear, it was recognition, as if she too had started remembering things she had never lived. The voice, the symbols, the mirrored names. We were not here by accident. The descent had not begun at the mountain or the tunnel, or even the first step underground. It had begun long before, in choices, in names, in promises made and never broken. I folded the floor plan and kept it. We searched the room, found no stairs, no hatch, but we found a vent, small, just large enough to crawl through. Behind it, a draft, warm and steady. We looked at each other. No one wanted to speak first, but someone had to. I volunteered. The others prepared rope and light. The engineer helped unscrew the grate. As I knelt, I thought I heard something from within. Not static, not breath, but a whisper. My name, and not as I knew it, but as Etienne used to say it years ago, when we believed that theater could save the world, and silence was only what came between lines. The crawl space closed behind me like the throat of the mountain itself. Once I had passed a bend, there was no light from the room I had left, only the copper flicker of my handheld torch glinting off the interior of a pipe not built for human passage. The walls pulsed with condensation, warm to the touch in a way that felt less like heat and more like breath. I moved slowly, the curve of my back pressing against the upper duct while my knees dragged forward, centimeter by centimeter, across the smooth incline. The silence here was not dead. It was dense, as though sound had been folded over on itself, repelled from its own echo. I counted seconds by breath, lost track of them after the 100th. The rope around my waist tightened twice, the signal from the medic that they were still there. I gave 2 tugs in return. Then I kept going. The pipe opened into a shaft vertical, ringed with metal brackets where wires had once been. I clipped the rope to one of them, tested its strength, then began the descent. There was no ladder, only the ridges of my grip. My boot slipped more than once. Halfway down, I heard it, not a sound, but the memory of one, a phrase spoken in French. Etienne's voice, clear and close. Ouvre la scène, pas la porte. Open the scene, not the door. We used to say it in rehearsals, when improvising exits that didn't exist. I stopped moving. The shaft swallowed my breath. I looked up. No face. No movement. Just a narrowing circle of light far above. I looked down. Nothing but blackness. When I reached the bottom, the floor gave slightly beneath my weight. Not wood, not metal. Something composite. Beneath my feet, a resonance, like standing atop a cello string. I stepped forward. The chamber lit itself as I moved, strips of phosphorescent paint awakening along the walls. The room was oval, windowless, built with sound in mind. No corners, no edges. Every wall curved to prevent the bounce of waveforms. In the center, a microphone, military grade, dustless, attached to a reel-to-reel machine that had no power source. Around the chamber, 12 chairs, each empty, each facing the center. On every seat, a set of headphones, coiled like waiting serpents. I approached the microphone. The tape reel spun, slowly, though no one had touched them. No light blinked, no voice emerged, until I stepped away. Then, from every wall, a whisper, not through speakers, but through the walls themselves, as if the concrete had memorized a voice and was trying to speak it back. It was Etienne again, older now, slower, reciting lines we had written together as boys. They weren't part of any play. They were ours, private, personal. J'ai laissé ma voix ici. Si tu l'entends, c'est que tu l'as cherché. I left my voice here. If you hear it, it's because you came looking. I sat in one of the chairs, placed the headphones over my ears. No hiss, no static, only breath. Then his voice again, not through a recording, but as if he were speaking from the other side of the glass. Tu m'as trouvé. You found me. I closed my eyes. The room seemed to rotate around me. He began to speak, not in sequence, but in fragments, memories without context. A summer in Lyon, the frost on a stage window, the time he broke his ankle mid-performance and finished the scene anyway, the night he asked me to promise I would follow if he ever disappeared. Not to find me, he'd said, but to understand why. I tried speaking. My voice didn't travel. The microphone ignored me. I removed the headphones, stood. The whispering walls continued, now layered. Other voices, not French, not German, something older, chanting in tones too low to transcribe. The language was vibration, the sound of breath before it became speech. It filled the chamber like rising water. I gripped the chair to steady myself. The microphone flared briefly, just a flicker, but the reels remained still. I wasn't supposed to speak. I was supposed to listen. There were marks on the walls, almost invisible under the light. I touched one. It burned cold. A spiral, the same as before. But this time, it pulsed when my skin met it. From somewhere beyond, behind the wall, or below the floor, a hum began. It wasn't mechanical. It was human, a held note, like a choir with no throat. It rose, deep and full, then fractured into harmonics. I felt in my ribs, behind my eyes, in the scar that ran down my arm from a war wound I no longer remember getting. The room dimmed. My knees buckled. Then silence again. I awoke lying on the floor. The chair tipped beside me. The machine was off. The microphone cold. But in my hand, something heavy. A reel of tape, unmarked, warm to the touch. I didn't remember taking it. It wasn't there before. But I knew whose voice was on it. Not Etienne's. Mine. and I hadn't said a word. The chamber had another door now, or perhaps it always had, and I had only just earned the right to see it. A hatch, recessed in the floor, marked with the same spiral symbol. I slid the reel into my pack, adjusted my torch, and opened it. Warm air rose from the dark. Not the breath of a place, but of someone waiting. The hatch didn't creak. It sighed, like old lungs exhaling after decades of stillness. I lowered myself through it slowly, boots brushing against a rusted ladder that vanished into warm blackness. The air shifted as I descended, less humid than above, but thicker, like stepping into the residue of breath long held. My hand stuck slightly to the metal rungs, not from moisture, but from something finer, powdery. When I reached the bottom, my torch flickered, not from dying light, but interference, as if the beam was being swallowed by something other than shadow. The chamber below was no longer hewn stone or concrete. It was older, natural rock walls smoothed by centuries, embedded with crystal veins and remnants of wooden scaffolding left to rot. Someone had built into a place that had been here long before them, and then they had stopped building. I took 3 steps forward and felt the temperature shift again. Then I heard the click, not from a machine, from my own pack. The reel I'd taken from the chamber above had begun to unwind itself. No device, no motor, just a reel unraveling in slow motion. The tape didn't fall to ground. It floated slightly, suspended in the air as if seeking direction. I watched, frozen. Then, as the final loop detached, it hovered a meter in front of me, stilled and pointed toward a narrow opening veiled by moss and wire mesh. I had no idea how it moved, but I knew I had to follow. The tape fell the moment I stepped in that direction. I took it, wound it tight, and placed it back into my coat. The passage narrowed, the air now dry and metallic, and then the corridor turned, sharply, into a small alcove lit by candles that should not have burned this long. At the center, a lectern made of welded parts, typewriter arms, compass faces, broken headsets, glass tubes etched with coordinates. On it, a single object, a key, but not one for any door. It was flat, shaped like a punch card with 3 holes, and an engraved phrase along the edge, "Su ne pan sorti." This is not an exit. I turned it over. On the reverse, a symbol, not a spiral this time, but a waveform, like a sound signature frozen in metal. Around the room, writing, burned into the rock with acid. French, Latin, German. Le son n'a pas besoin de bouche. Sound does not need a mouth. Die Stimme bleibt, wenn der Körper geht. The voice remains when the body is gone. And one phrase repeated a dozen times, scratched deep in the others. And no entry without witness. I pressed my hand to the key. The rock behind the lectern vibrated slightly. I stepped closer and the wall trembled, then retracted. A mechanical passage masked by nature. No motor groan, no panel opened. It simply wasn't there anymore. And beyond it, a vault. There were shelves lined with recording devices from every decade of the last century. Wax cylinders, magnetic reels, digital cartridges. Each labeled in handwriting. Not official archives. Personal logs. Some bore names. Others only symbols. One shelf was marked with a name I knew too well, Etienne Marichal. And beneath it, a single cartridge, newer than the rest, labeled Belland. I didn't remember recording anything. I hadn't, not consciously, but something in me knew what was inside. I looked for a player, found one, inserted the cartridge. No sound, then a breath, then my voice, speaking words I never said aloud. You came because you had to, because silence is never empty. It only waits. I staggered back. The tape continued. If you've heard this, then you've opened what I closed. And what I closed was never mine to seal. Then Etienne's voice took over. Calm, resigned, crude. I stayed because it asked me to, and I said yes. The vault went cold. The waveform on the key began to glow faintly. I turned and saw, embedded in the far wall, a panel that matched the key's dimensions. No knob, no lock, just the impression of that waveform. I placed the key in. It didn't click. It sank. The wall shimmered, not like a door opening, but like the space itself forgot to exist. A chamber unfolded beyond it. Not wide, not tall, but endless in another sense. A sensory vacuum. There was no sound, not even the movement of my own breath inside my ears. Just absence. At the center of this void, a chair, facing nothing. On the seat, a headset. En bonne atit a note in French. Celui qui écoute reste. He who listens stays. I stepped back, but the wall behind me had already closed. I was inside something that did not want me to leave. The headset buzzed faintly. I reached for it, then hesitated. Not from fear, from memory. I had heard Etienne's voice. I had followed his path, and now I stood at the threshold of his final choice. He hadn't died. He hadn't fled. He had sat in this chair, placed a headset, and listened, and whatever he heard changed the sound of everything that came after. I picked up the headset. The headset was colder than it should have been. Not cold from metal left untouched, but cold with purpose, as if designed to draw the warmth out of thought. When I placed it over my ears, there was no static, no hum, just the immediate and absolute suppression of sound. Not silence. Silence is texture. This was void, the kind that pressed against your heartbeat like a second pulse, like breath held under water long enough to forget air ever existed. I waited. Seconds? Minutes? Time slid sideways. Then something emerged. Not a voice, but a shape behind the silence. It pushed forward slowly, like a figure behind frosted glass, until the sound broke through, not in words but in rhythm. A cadence I knew. Etienne. His voice entered not through the ears but into thought itself, bypassing the mechanics of hearing. Belland. It said, like someone lighting a match in the dark. You made it. Then it has already begun again. The words weren't spoken. They were remembered, like dreams from a night that never happened. I tried to reply, but my mouth wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't twitch. Only my mind could respond. What is this place? I thought or felt. His reply came not as answer, but wait. This was no bunker, no base. It had been something else long before the Reich laid cables through its roots. The mountain had carried voices for centuries. The Etruscans said it whispered names. The Romans claimed their gods slept beneath its stone. The Wehrmacht had dug here not for strategy, but because someone higher than them believed this mountain would speak back. And it had. Not in language, in resonance, in memory. They built chambers to harness the echo, tunnels to amplify frequency, rooms without echo so they could hear what shouldn't bounce. And then they stopped, not because they finished, but because they were warned. The headset trembled against my skull as Etienne's presence deepened. I heard them, he said, not just echoes, not just traces. I heard what the mountain kept hidden. And then I heard my own voice among them. He hadn't survived. He hadn't been taken. He had stayed, voluntarily. Because once you listen long enough, the silence stops being empty. It starts being aware. And aware things ask for response. The chamber around me pulsed. The walls breathed with slow pressure. The vault hadn't sealed me in. It had introduced me. I wasn't alone, not in the sense of presence, but in the deeper, older sense that the space was occupied by memory more real than flesh. I understood now why Etienne stayed. Not to be with them, but to keep them from spreading. Some knowledge isn't meant to be destroyed, only contained, guarded, translated for no one. A voice asked again, not Etienne's, but older, layered with centuries. Do you understand your part? And I did. The key was never a key. The door was never a door. This was not a prison. This was the last station, the final relay. And someone always had to sit in the chair. Always. A mind to filter the signal. A consciousness to hold the pressure. I tried to lift the headset, but my arms were no longer mine. The signal had rooted. My thoughts slowed, then elongated. I could see flashes of cities, wars, languages shifting like tectonic plates. I saw Etienne sitting in the same chair, smiling as if remembering a sunset that never happened. I saw the Roman engineers carving the first acoustic tunnels, centuries before they had words for resonance. I saw the black chamber, the photographs, the voices burned into rock. The mountain was not a transmitter. It was a memory, and now I was part of it. The tape inside my coat clicked once. Then again, it had begun recording on its own, not magnetic, not analog, recording me, not my voice, my thoughts, my being. And one day, someone else would find it. Another interpreter, another promise. I understood now why Etienne had addressed me directly on the tape. He hadn't predicted I would come. He had made sure only I could. That someone who knew him, truly knew him, would sit here next. Not by accident, but by bond. The room trembled. The signal pulsed slower, softer. My breathing returned. The headset slid off. I opened my eyes. I was still seated. The chair had aged beneath me. The room was quiet, but not dead. The walls still shimmered with stored frequency. I had not become Etienne. I had not been consumed, but I had taken the place he left behind. His name was gone from the shelf. Only mine remained. I walked to the vault door. It had returned. The key was back in my hand, warm now, not cold, and this time it clicked into the wall. The waveform blinked once, then nothing. I stepped through. The corridor was dimmer, the shelves untouched, but the candlelight was new. Someone had come, or was coming. I took the cartridge labeled Bellin and placed it where Etienne's had been. A new log, a new warning, and beneath it, I scratched a message into the metal shelf with my pocket knife. Not a warning, a whisper. Le silence est vivant. Silence is alive. Then I walked the long path back toward the hatch, leaving the headset on the chair. Waiting. There was no mechanism to the door, no wheel to turn, no code to enter. Just a slab of iron as thick as my torso and as silent as the weight behind it. I hadn't closed it, and yet it stood shut. I pressed my palm to the cold metal, and something pulsed faintly from within, not heat, but intention. As if the chamber itself recognized I was no longer the same man who entered. On the wall to the right, someone had left a mark I hadn't seen before. 3 vertical lines, etched deep and deliberate, with a 4th crossing them at a slant. It was a tally, and I knew it wasn't mine. The others were still here, not in flesh, but in decision. I moved down the corridor, the air heavier with each step, as if it clung to memory like dust to skin. Behind me, the chair waited, empty again, but never vacant. Each generation left someone behind, and now that task passed me, but I was still walking. Not out of defiance, not yet, out of necessity. The chamber known only in the files as Sector D-11 came into view, unlike the others. Its door was always open. Bellin had described it once, before any of us had come here, as the room no one could seal, because it refused closure. No hinge could hold it. No bolt would latch. The document spoke of failures. Doors torn from their frames. Welds snapped like twigs. A vacuum not of air, but of intent. What was stored inside, no one truly recorded. Only that it existed. I stepped into the threshold, and at once, the pressure changed. Sound became layered, as if hearing through someone else's ears. My boots scuffed the ground louder than they should have. My breath echoed, then paused, then returned out of rhythm. The space did not like rhythm. It swallowed familiarity. Along the far wall was a device I'd seen referenced, but never believed real, a resonance prism. Not glass, not metal, just a suspended form that reflected no light, but rippled like water caught in a loop. I approached it slowly, heart ticking like a metronome against an orchestra of silence. Then the whisper began. It wasn't a voice. Not really. It was the absence of one. The moment before a voice, stretched and thinned until the silence itself became shape. And that shape pressed against the bones of my skull with memory not mine. I saw fields of static machines, dials turned without hands, switches flipped with no fingers. I saw men in uniform with no flags, walking halls that bent in impossible ways. I saw her, a woman with no name, seated in a chamber similar to mine, decades, maybe centuries ago. Her face was calm, her eyes closed, but her hands never stopped moving, writing onto paper that burned before the ink dried. And then she looked up, directly at me, through time, Through echo, her lips moved in perfect stillness. "If you hear me, you are next." Then gone. The prism shattered soundlessly. The chamber shuddered. And from every corner, voices flooded in not words, but final thoughts. Things left unsaid, etched into the architecture of this mountain. Belland, Etienne, the others. Not alive, not dead. Remembered, not remembered. I backed away. Pulse thundered in my jaw. The prism was gone, but the memory remained, etched into my ribs. That woman had sat before me, held the silence, passed the weight. And now I knew this place had never been abandoned, only handed down, keeper to keeper, each one believing they were the last, each one wrong. My thoughts spiraled toward the men above. Had they survived the cave-in? Had they reached command? Would anyone ever return? It didn't matter. This chamber had waited for no one. It chose when to open. It chose what to reveal. I had not earned its secrets, only stumbled into them by proximity to a man I once called friend. And now I was being shaped, not informed, molded, not guided. I left the room with slower steps, as if dragging the weight of what I had seen. I passed the tally again. It was no longer 3 marks and a slash. A new mark had appeared beneath them. Faint, fresh, my hand. I didn't remember carving it. The final corridor felt like descending into the breath between heartbeats, too long, too silent, too full of something waiting. My steps no longer echoed. The walls had absorbed that privilege. There was no sound but the pull of fabric, the creak of joints, the private noise the body makes when it believes it is alone. I passed a row of vents humming without power, a conduit blinking red, even though nothing had been charged in decades. The architecture shifted subtly, angles no longer aligned, and the ceiling narrowed, not by construction, but by some unseen choice of the space itself. At the end stood a door thinner than the others. A contradiction. Everything here had been built with thickness, redundancy, as if to contain, not invite. But this was a door meant to let something out, or to suggest that nothing needed walls anymore. There was no handle. I reached forward, expecting resistance. None came. The door moved with the touch of air. Beyond it, a circular chamber, small, perfectly round. And in the center, an old field recorder untouched by dust. Its reel was frozen mid-turn. A chair beside it, turned just slightly away from the door, the way people do when they're not expecting company. On the wall, an inscription, handwritten, faint but persistent, like something someone had traced over with trembling memory. Noise is just memory escaping form. I approached the recorder and sat. The chair accepted weight, like it remembered the man before me. I touched the machine. It clicked, then whirred, then settled into a rhythm that matched neither clock nor pulse. The reel moved. The sound began. It wasn't Etienne's voice. Not at first. It was a collection of attempts, people reading lines, stammering, failing, the recordings of those tasked to say something they didn't understand. Then silence, and then him, clear, certain, Etienne reading a passage I knew by heart. What cannot be buried must be carried. What cannot be carried must be named. And what cannot be named must be given silence. He paused. A breath. I chose the third. A second voice responded. My own, or someone with the same cadence. The same were on their vowels. But I had never been here before. Never spoken those words. Then I will remain, the voice said, and the tape clicked. That was all. Except it wasn't. From the corners of the room, the air tightened. Not wind, not pressure, but presence. Like a crowd had entered without bodies, only intent. I rose, looked at the tape. It had rewound itself, spinning, waiting for another voice to imprint itself. And for the first time, I knew what was expected. Not escape, not report, not survival. Witness. I could not leave. There was no path. The map had dissolved behind me. The entrance collapsed. The others, if they lived, would never find this corridor again. That was the pattern. It never repeated. The place moved, shifted. It had never wanted captors, only custodians. I sat once more. The chair had accepted men heavier with regret. I spoke, not to the machine, but to whatever memory lay waiting beyond the real. My name is Jacques Duffert, age 43, communications officer, 3rd Detachment, Southern Sector. I was never trained for this. I am not brave. I did not come here to die. But I will not let what lives here leave without its name. The recorder clicked off, not paused, not stopped. Satisfied, behind me, the thin door sealed, not with a sound, with absence, complete, final. I stayed, not because I was trapped, but because this story, like all stories buried under war, needed someone to remain still enough to hear it without breaking it again. And in that silence, where no echo dared linger, the memory finally slept. They told him the station was dead, abandoned, gutted, reclaimed by snow and time. Yet when Merrick Novak crossed a ridge above Zvolen and descended into the hollow car by pine and fog, he could hear it before he saw it. A hiss, steady and low, crawling through the air like the breath of something old and buried. It wasn't wind, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't silent. The outpost sat hunched against the slope, half collapsed, its metal roof crumpled in on itself like a lung punctured by frost. But the antenna still stood, black against the gray sky, pointing nowhere and everywhere. Merrick had seen Soviet engineers rip down taller ones in Poland. He'd helped. But this one remained not forgotten, but left as if the forest had decided to ignore its presence rather than erase it. The others were already inside. 6 men, none of whom knew him. Not really. A Soviet lieutenant who barely spoke Czech, 2 Slovak partisans with eyes like spent coals, a Polish radio man with frostbitten fingers, and an Estonian boy whose age Merrick couldn't place. Somewhere between 17 and 40. All of them cold. All of them waiting. When Merrick arrived, they didn't ask questions. Just nodded, handed him a map that no longer matched the terrain, and pointed toward the equipment room, where the noise was loudest. The room smelled like rust and ozone. Dust clung to the consoles in a fine layer, but the needles still danced. The oscilloscopes pulsed. Something was alive here, even if the source had died long ago. Merrick set down his satchel, unrolled a bundle of cloth, and pulled out a set of tools he hadn't touched since before the Germans came. He didn't want to be here. Not again. But the past had a way of digging its claws into present, and this mountain had been calling for days now, not with words, but with repetition. Static that didn't fade, hiss that didn't sleep. He calibrated the dials, reset the gain, checked the wiring behind the panels. Most of it was corroded, but not all. Some wires had been replaced. Recent work, and not amateur. Someone had been here after the Wehrmacht left, after the files were torched and the signals supposedly buried. Someone who knew how to keep a frequency alive without detection. He leaned closer to the speaker. Beneath the static, a rhythm, not Morse, not code, just pulses like breath, regular, familiar. His hands hesitated. The last time he'd heard this kind of pattern was during a test, Prague, 1938. A signal masking project no one spoke of anymore. Back then, Merrick had helped design systems to filter interference from long-range broadcasts. They thought it could be used for intelligence. But what they filtered out didn't always stay gone. Sometimes it echoed. Sometimes it came back clearer. The Estonian stood at the door, watching. Merrick waved him in. Together they tracked the line from the antenna into the concrete below. The snow had been cleared recently. Boots fresh, not military issue. Too narrow, too clean. The trail led behind the station to a rusted grate, half buried under pine needles and shale. When they pried it open, the hiss grew louder, deeper, as if the earth itself exhaled through broken teeth. The tunnel beyond descended at a slope too perfect to be natural. The others gathered, rifles raised, but Merrick asked them to wait. He needed to understand what the station had been built on. The Poles called the forest cursed. The Soviets called it strategic. Merrick called it unfinished business. He descended first, boots skidding on wet stone, breath foggy in the cold that didn't match the surface. The air was wrong, thick metallic. It carried sound in strange ways. Footsteps doubled back. Breathing echoed in reverse. He reached a junction where old power lines branched out like veins. One cable was still warm. He placed a hand on the wall, and it vibrated slightly, like a chest with a heartbeat. Behind him, one of the partisans muttered a prayer. They'd all seen enough in this war to stop pretending ghosts weren't real. Down the corridor, a doorway, reinforced, sealed, but not locked. The radio static was louder here, not from speakers but from the stone itself. The signal came from below, not above. When Merrick turned back to group, no one asked what they'd found. They knew the war had left behind many dead things. Not all of them were quiet, and not all of them wanted to stay buried. The morning after their descent into the tunnel, Merrick stood outside the ruined station, his boots sinking into a layer of snow too quiet for the sounds that still whispered from the antenna above. The forest was still. No birds, no wind. Just that faint crackle in the air like an ember refusing to die. He stared at the tree line, wondering how many trees had been planted deliberately. How many branches had been broken not by storm or animal, but by men hiding cables under frost and pine needles. The others were inside, sleeping or pretending to. The Soviet lieutenant had said nothing after the tunnel was discovered, only sent a coded message that no one had responded to. The Estonian had taken to drawing shapes in the frost on the windows. None of them seemed eager to talk about what they heard in the static or what they saw in that darkness. Merrick couldn't forget the warmth of that single cable or the way the metal in the walls had hummed when he touched it. Something was still flowing beneath the mountain. Not power, exactly. Not life, but a persistence, as if the mountain had been taught to remember, and now it refused to forget. He took a spade and began to dig near the tower, following the path the signal might have taken. The snow was thin here, unnatural for the altitude. Beneath it, packed soil that crumbled too easily, disturbed recently. Then wires, frayed and black, running deeper than any local installation would allow. He kept digging. Every meter revealed more, coils, conduits, bundled in cloth and wax, stamped with Reich marks, some marked in Cyrillic, some with no language at all. When the others joined him, no one asked what he was looking for. They only stared at the lines stretching into the earth, like veins too deep to bleed. The Estonian boy traced one wire westward, his fingers numb, his lips murmuring something in his own tongue. Merrick followed him as they crawled between trees, over rocks, down a shallow gully half-choked with frozen mud. There, the line split into two. One strand continued west. The other curved toward a slope where a formation of boulders formed an almost perfect triangle, like the mouth of a forgotten god. Behind them, the Polish radio man shouted. He'd found something. Another line. A third path, buried shallow under the roots of a pine, twisted into itself like it had grown in protest. All the cables, 3 directions, 3 sources, or one system. Merrick didn't believe in design by accident. He knelt at the base of the triangle of stone. There, tucked between frostbitten moss and iron filings, was a hatch. The hinges had rusted, but not locked. A mark was carved into the steel, a spiral, coiled inward like a vortex. He remembered it from old sketches in a report he once helped write. He had laughed back then, thought it superstition. An acoustic insignia, meant to represent a frequency that could pierce layered signals. A myth, they'd said, but now it was real, and the signal was humming to the floor again. They forced the hatch open. The darkness inside was total, but warm, somehow, not in temperature, but in sensation, as if entering something that had waited for too long to be noticed. Steps descended at a shallow angle, carved into stone, not metal. Every wall was lined with copper wire, coiled like muscles under skin. No junctions, no power source. Yet still the hiss was stronger here, pressing against their ears like the sea in a seashell. They reached the door without a handle. It opened inward at their touch. The room beyond was empty, except for a single frame mounted on the far wall, and beneath it, a device half typewriter, half recorder, with keys that matched no known language. Merrick approached slowly. The typewriter clicked, once, on its own, then again, then faster. Letters filled the page, but not Latin, not Cyrillic, shapes that pulsed with rhythm rather than meaning. The Polish radio man began to sob quietly. The lieutenant backed out. The Estonian stared at the keys, then whispered, "They're responding." Merrick pressed a hand to the nearest wall. It was warm, vibrating. The signal wasn't just being broadcast. It was being received. Somewhere, someone or something was listening, and now it had heard them too. The signal returned just before dawn, not as a shriek or a hum this time, but as a deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat tapped in static. Merrick sat beside the Polish radio man. The receiver pressed close. Headphones clamped so tightly they left red marks on his skin. The cold in the room felt thicker than before, not from the air, but from something unsaid between the walls. The Soviet lieutenant stood in the doorway with arms folded and face still unreadable, but Merrick saw his breath hitch with every sound that came through the headphones. The transmission repeated itself. 5 bursts, then a pause, then 3 shorter ones. They recorded it on paper. Morse, but the rhythm wasn't right. It didn't align with anything listed in their books. The Polish soldier, lips trembling, translated the sounds the best he could. Not a command, not coordinates. It was a name none of them recognized, but which Merrick felt pressing against his chest like a memory he couldn't place. Not a full name, not even a word. Just a call sign, 3 syllables, each rising in tone. Not German, not Russian. Older, raw. Merrick recognized that tone, though he had designed that sequence once, years ago, for a testing facility buried under concrete far to the west, near Brno. They were testing emotional response patterns in machine-aided speech, trying to make static convey urgency, to give fear a sound. He had buried that paper when the project was shut down, or so he thought. He leaned in and began matching the tones by humming them. The signal responded, not instantly, but with a delay that felt intentional, like something watching from far away and choosing its moment. Then came the shift. The second message arrived not in Morse, but as bursts of audio, spoken almost human, but buried in distortion. Merrick caught pieces. A child's voice, or an old woman's. Laughter warped into sobs. Syllables bent until meaning cracked. Then a word. Oral. The room went still. No one moved. The Estonian boy dropped his notebook. Merrick turned toward the group slowly. That word wasn't random. That was the name of the canceled experiment. He had seen it etched into the margins of documents. Heard it whispered in the corridors of a lab no longer on any map. A sound-based interrogation system, based on resonant memory, they had said. But the final tests were pulled because of lingering effects. That was the phrase used, lingering effects. The kind that remained in the human body like radiation. The kind that left voices inside even after the devices were shut down. It's not a location, Merrick said aloud, voice hollow. It's an imprint. The lieutenant demanded clarification, but Merrick didn't answer. He was remembering the schematics, the way the signal could loop until it embedded itself in the auditory cortex. How some of the scientists involved had reported hearing themselves speaking in languages they never learned. That was years ago, and now the name had returned, from a radio that shouldn't work, through cables that shouldn't carry power, from a place that should have been rubble. They followed the second wire path down toward the tree line, careful not to speak too loudly. The snow had stopped, but the wind brought with it something worse, a silence that pressed against the skin, heavy and expectant. Near the slope, another structure, buried mostly, but the outline of a bunker emerged from the drift. Its doors twisted open as if something inside had grown too large to be contained. The inside stank of rust and wet concrete. Mold crawled along the ceiling in perfect lines, not organic, but geometric, like veins on a blueprint. In the center of the room, a single device still blinked. No batteries, no wires, just one red light, pulsing at the same rhythm as the signal. And around it, symbols etched into the floor with metal tools, not just letters, but patterns meant to vibrate, to echo if spoken. Merrick didn't dare speak them. He watched as the Polish soldier stepped forward and touched the device. The red light turned green, then blue, then white. His eyes widened. He began to repeat the same 3 syllables over and over, not shouting, not whispering, just repeating. The signal was no longer coming from outside. It was coming from inside him, and when Merrick touched the wall, he understood the frequency had found a new transmitter. It was not the voice that disturbed Merrick most, nor the light that changed colors without power, nor even the frost that refused to melt around the device pulsing like a buried heart. It was the recognition, not of the signal itself, but of its architecture, the structure beneath the chaos. Merrick had once drawn it, not in full, not like this, but in fragments, sequences of frequency modulations meant to trigger emotional resonance. He had drafted it under orders, back in a lab that pretended to be part of the Ministry of Communication, but had no address and no post. The project had a name, Oral, a falcon, but what it hunted was not flight, but memory. They told him it was theoretical, a fail-safe in auditory warfare, designed to disarm without firing. Resonant pulses triggering confusion, nostalgia, guilt. Feelings so intimate they weaken resolve. But they never told him about the second phase. That was kept from engineers. That was when the pulses began to linger. When researchers spoke of hearing songs no one played, of dreams in other voices. Merrick had left when the doors were sealed. He'd sworn forget. Yet here it was, the signature of his own pen, in the way the signal modulated, how the syllables moved like they were breathing. He felt his stomach twist as he watched the soldier, the one who had touched the transmitter, now seated, unmoving, eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist. He mouthed a phrase repeatedly, a string of sounds that didn't belong to any language. Merrick stepped closer, whispered his name, but the man didn't blink. When Merrick touched his shoulder, the soldier exhaled a single sentence. It was in Czech, but not just Czech. It was Marek's dialect, from his home province. Words Merrick had only heard from his mother. You buried it under the wrong mountain. The lieutenant stared. What did he say? Merrick didn't answer. His knees weakened. His hands trembled. The sentence was one he had once written in a notebook that no longer existed. It was a safety code embedded in a private journal during the final test cycle of Oral. No one else had ever read it, not even the military official who reviewed the closure. So how did this man say it? The soldier looked at him. Finally, but it was not his eyes looking. It was something else behind them. Something watching Merrick, studying. He stepped back. The radio man continued whispering. The lieutenant ordered him restrained. The boy from Estonia refused to come near. They left him tied near the corridor. With a scarf over his eyes, his mouth gagged. The silence he emitted felt louder than any scream. That night, Merrick sat outside the bunker entrance, hands dirty from snow and rust, and stared at the sky he no longer trusted. He remembered the lab, how they tested the early prototypes on animals first, dogs that barked at walls, mice that stopped moving when certain tones played, and later, when they used volunteers, those who had nothing to lose, how their stories always changed. They didn't recall the test. They recalled other lives, other deaths. Some claimed to remember how it felt to drown, or burn, or be born. Sensory bleed. The doctors called it neural echo. But none of them predicted this. A signal that could speak in memories that weren't yours, or worse, that were yours but forgotten. Merrick took out his old field notebook, the one he carried through deployments. Most pages were blank, but now, faint markings had appeared on the edge of one, as if heat had revealed ink. He stared at it for minutes before recognizing the code, his own cipher. A date, a frequency, a name, Oral. He burned the page, but it didn't stop the pulse in his ears. That night, he dreamed of his father's voice, though his father had died before the war began. In the dream, he said, "You left the door open, Merrick. Now you must be the one to close it." And when he woke, the bunker was humming again. The frost no longer felt like weather. It pressed against Marek's skin with purpose. Not chill, more pressure than cold. Beneath the snow, the cable snaked downward, disappearing into a slope that looked solid until touched. They had cleared the entry with shovels and steam, but the surface beneath had no grain, no sign of natural stone. It was smooth, poured, almost glass-like, the shape of a slope that had been melted into submission. It did not belong to any construction technique Merrick had known, not even among the advanced German installations he'd studied. The slope ended in a dark opening framed by steel. The kind of entrance that didn't wait for you. The kind that opened once and stayed hungry. The team descended in silence, lights barely keeping up with their breaths. The boy from Estonia no longer spoke. His eyes wandered along the tunnel, as if waiting for it to say something first. The lieutenant ordered him to stay behind at the entry with the radio. He nodded, but never looked at the man. As Merrick stepped inside, the walls shimmered faintly with the beam of his torch. Not reflection, reaction, as if the surface remembered being lit before. The floor was dry, too dry, dustless. There were no signs of erosion, no roots intruding, no condensation. It was sterile, but not new. Time had passed here. It just hadn't settled. 100 meters in, the tunnel split. Left led downward. Right remained level. The lieutenant chose left. Downward, always downward. The floor changed slightly. No longer steel or fused stone, but a texture like compressed ash, firm yet soft underfoot. Merrick crouched, ran his fingers along it, then smelled them. Burnt minerals, charcoal, bone dust. He didn't say it aloud. The path narrowed, not in structure, but in pressure. The air itself seemed to thicken. Breathing became labor. One of the soldiers coughed. A wet, sharp sound, and blood followed. No one stopped. The walls, now closer, were lined with veins of black wiring, running like nerves through an artificial body. And then the pulse returned, barely audible, a frequency so low it could only be felt in the back of the teeth and the pit of the stomach. It came in waves, like distant artillery. But each wave didn't end. It receded with residue, like it left something inside them. The corridor opened into a circular chamber, dome-shaped, with no visible seams or exits. At the center, a pedestal rose from the ground, featureless except for a hollow at its top. Merrick approached cautiously. The moment he passed a certain threshold, his lantern flickered and went dark. So did the others. Yet the room did not go black. It glowed faintly from within, from the walls themselves. A blue phosphorescence that made no shadows, no corners, no depth. Faces looked flat, voices carried without echo. The lieutenant's orders came slower, each syllable seeming to drag across an invisible curtain. Merrick reached the pedestal. He touched it. It was cold, but not lifeless. He felt it react, not physically, but acoustically. A new pulse, sharper, focused, aimed. It passed through him, and for a moment he saw nothing, not the room, not the men, only a shape burned into his inner vision, a ring intersected with a vertical line, the same symbol etched into a metal plate back in a lab at Prague, long before he ever held a weapon. When the light returned, one of the soldiers was gone. No sound, no scream. He had been standing at the edge, barely a meter away. Merrick called his name. Nothing. The chamber offered no answer. No one ran. No one even moved. They looked at the pedestal, then each other, then the floor. The compressed ash was no longer dry. It held a footprint, one more than they had entered with. The lieutenant ordered retreat. Merrick stayed back a moment, stared again into the hollow of the pedestal. Something was etched inside. Small letters, checked, misspelled. Come home. Not a command. Not a plea. A memory misplaced. On the way back, they didn't speak. The tunnel felt longer, the air thinner. And as they emerged into the snow once more, Merrick looked at the sky and knew, with an engineer's certainty, that something below had never stopped listening. They had entered a room that had never been empty, only waiting. The snow that greeted them outside no longer sounded like snow. It landed too quietly, as if each flake were already expected. The team emerged pale, wet, and blinking, but something about their gaze felt displaced, not unfocused, but redirected inward, like they were watching echoes rather than scenes. Merrick didn't look back at the tunnel. He didn't need to. Its presence followed without mass, trailing behind his boots like an afterthought no one wanted to admit. The Estonian boy was no longer at the post. His radio buzzed faintly on the log where he had sat, antenna bent slightly, but no sign of him, no footprints leading away. Just a shift in the cold, and a faint warmth under the earpiece. The lieutenant raised his voice, but stopped halfway. The snow absorbed sound too quickly now, not muffled, erased. Inside the barracks, what little heat remained was drawn up by their silence. No one reached for food or dry uniforms. They sat around the table where the maps lay unrolled. The line where the tunnel had been marked was smeared, a drip of melted snow, Merrick assumed, but the rest of the map was intact. Yet it didn't feel like a map anymore. It looked like a prediction. He remembered the print inside the pedestal. Come home. Someone had etched that, but why check? Why so childishly misspelled? Before he could follow that thought, the sound returned. This time, not as a pulse. It came through the active radio. A low murmur, not quite speech, but not static either, like syllables remembered by something that didn't have a mouth. Merrick leaned in. The lieutenant told him not to touch it. Merrick ignored him. He adjusted the frequency wheel by the millimeter. The tone sharpened, shifted upward, then stabilized. A voice, female, young, speaking in perfect Slovak. The words were simple. Are you listening now? Then silence. The lieutenant jerked the cord out of the socket. The room fell still again, but no one relaxed. Someone lit a lamp. The flame flickered not from wind, but from an inconsistency in the room's air itself. The fire didn't move like fire. It swayed to a rhythm Merrick recognized. The same one from the pedestal. A frequency expressed in shape. One of the soldiers grabbed a pencil and began drawing on the back of a ration box without looking. Circular arcs, split lines, angles marked in sound values. When Merrick called his name, the man blinked and stopped. He didn't remember doing it. Merrick took the box. The diagram was unmistakable. He had seen it once, during his time with the Prague engineers. It was a design for a sonic mirror, a structure that did not emit sound but caught and held it like a fly in amber. He hadn't understood it then. Now, he wasn't sure if he did, or the understanding was simply being placed in his head, like a memory not earned. The lieutenant wanted to shut down the radios. Merrick argued. Whatever was speaking to them wasn't broadcasting. It was reacting, responding to presence, to proximity, like a room designed not for storage, but for listening and remembering. They activated a secondary receiver, one used for coded transmissions. At 2:41 a.m., the same voice returned. It's not the ear that remembers. It's the echo. This time, the voice was older. Male, Marek is Brett Shortend. He knew that voice. It belonged to a professor who had mentored him a decade earlier, a man who disappeared during the German annexation. There had never been any record of what happened to him. But here it was, threaded into the noise of a snow-blanketed station in Zvolen. The others heard it too. No one dared say the name. The radio clicked. Not off, just dormant, like a mouth pausing mid-sentence. Merrick stood and left the room, without a word. He walked back to the slope, flashlight off. The tunnel did not glow. It waited. He pressed his hand against the steel. The cold was familiar now. It had a memory, and it pressed back. He didn't enter. Not yet, but he spoke, softly, into the windless dark. What are you listening for? No answer came, but the snow no longer landed on his coat. It moved around him, as if to keep the sound clear. Behind him, the radio sparked again. The lieutenant called for him. Merrick didn't turn around. He stayed there until morning. The sun rose like it had forgotten to bring heat. A pale disk above the pines, barely parting the gray. Merrick returned from the slope without speaking. No one asked what he'd found, because they had begun to understand that questions in this place weren't answered. They were absorbed. The radio, for the moment, remained silent, but the flame in the lantern by the table still pulsed with an unseen rhythm, slow, like a breath under ice. That morning, they began cataloging the room they had marked as the central archive. It had been locked when they arrived days ago, and until now, no one had dared open it. But the key wasn't a key. It was a pattern. Merrick recognized the locking mechanism not as mechanical, but sonic. When they had adjusted the frequency on the radio the night before, something had triggered, and now the door stood slightly ajar. They stepped inside. It smelled of dust and cold metal, but also something older, not decay, but preservation. Inside were cabinets lined with parchment diagrams and reels of magnetic tape. The pages were drawn in ink, so pale it shimmered like frost. At the center of the room lay a single notebook, leather-bound and perfectly placed. Merrick opened it and turned the pages with care. No names, no dates, but each page held sketches and technical annotations. Schematics of acoustic chambers, resonance maps, human cochlea drawn with obsessive detail, then overlaid with designs not biological but geometric. In one section, a series of portraits, soldiers, unnamed, but the resemblance to current members of their team was chilling. One looked like the Estonian boy who'd vanished. Another bore Mark's own eyes, but younger. In the margin of that page, in note, they return in shape, not in self. He didn't tell the others. The lieutenant found another bundle, a folder of carbon copies with messages typed in German, stamped with Wehrmacht seals, but the language shifted midway through, interlaced with Latin, then Czech. All the signatures had been removed. The final page was blank, except for a circle drawn in the lower corner, within it the word oral. Marek's hands trembled. Oral had been the name whispered during a failed research initiative back in Prague, a project so obscure it had only been discussed in code among engineers. The goal had been theoretical. Capture not sound, but memory of sound, stored in mechanical form. Play it back in situations where speech was impossible. A voice recorder for the unconscious mind. The project was shelved, or so they believed. And yet here, under Zvolen, it had found form. They took nothing from the archive. Something about the pages resisted separation. But Merrick scanned the pages into his own notes, redrawing the symbols slowly, careful to copy even the imperfections. The diagrams began to arrange themselves into a sequence, not of invention, but of invocation. Sound as signal, signal as memory, memory as architecture. Outside, snow fell again, this time silent as ash. One of the men by the door began whispering to himself. The others didn't notice at first. But Merrick did. The whisper wasn't random. It was a transmission, a code he had used once when he was younger, when he and a classmate had developed their own shortwave cipher to pass forbidden notes past inspection. That classmate had died in 1940. Or at least, that was the official report. Merrick grabbed the man's shoulders. "Where did you hear that?" The soldier blinked. "Hear what?" But the voice continued, even though his lips didn't move anymore. The sound came within his chest, as if replayed by his lungs, not formed by his throat. Merrick turned to the others. "We have to leave." But the lieutenant stepped forward. "Not yet. We're past the halfway point." Merrick tried to argue, but then the flame in the lantern flared and died. The radio clicked once more. The female voice returned. "You drew the shapes. Now you must hear what they've drawn back." The lieutenant lifted the receiver, but didn't speak. No one did. Outside, the wind rose, not in volume, but in precision. It carried not noise, but pattern. It wasn't wind. It was listening. They sealed the archive without discussing it, as though naming it aloud would render its contents permanent. The notebook Merrick had copied weighed more than paper should. He could feel it in his pack, a silent drum against the spine. Snow pressed harder against the world, and even the light seemed brittle. The descent resumed. The cable led deeper into the tunnels, and with each meter the temperature dropped, but it wasn't cold that made their breath slow. Something else moved in the air, a current that passed through lungs, not over skin. One of the partisans, Dusan, was the first to falter. He touched one of the old transmitters embedded in the wall, its casing frosted over and marked with unfamiliar glyphs. The moment his fingers made contact, he convulsed, knees buckling, jaw slackening, as if a string had snapped inside him. They carried him to the nearest bench of stone. His eyes fluttered beneath the lids, and when they opened, they were unfocused. He spoke, but not in Slovak, not in Russian, not even in German. The words came in fragments, ancient roots wrapped around modern cadence. Syllables twisted like iron coils. Dead languages breathed through a modern chest. Merrick leaned closer, horrified but mesmerized. What came from Dusan's mouth resembled liturgical Latin, but inverted, reordered. Mixed with it were bursts of radio static, digital tones that shouldn't exist in this era. The lieutenant recorded it with a portable reel. After a minute, the speech ceased. Doosan collapsed completely. Still alive, but vacant. Something had taken space inside him, and now that space was echoing. They moved him to the outer room near the ventilation shaft, hoping the cold would preserve what remained of him. But the silence grew thicker. The radios, all of them, began to hiss without being touched. Static, but not random. Rhythmic, not music, not voice. A signal. Merrick sat beside the equipment and watched the oscillograph. The lines danced in pulses, fast and slow, like a heart unsure of its beat. Every time it peaked, he felt pressure behind his eyes. Not pain, but presence. He turned off the machine. The signal kept going. That night, sleep was no longer possible. Every attempt to close the eyes brought flashes, not dreams, but images too precise to invent. Maps without borders. Faces distorted by lenses that didn't exist. A symbol repeating behind the eyelids. The circle with the word oral at its center. Merrick woke before dawn, sweat clinging despite the chill. He went outside the bunker entrance, into the open air that no longer comforted. There, beneath the sheet of snow that crusted the antenna mount, something pulsed. Not light, not vibration. A presence. He brushed the surface and uncovered a core of metal humming faintly, barely visible unless you touched it. When he leaned down, his breath aligned with it. Inhalation, pause, exhalation, pause, pulse, 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 as if the mountain itself was breathing. Inside, the others had noticed the same phenomenon, but no one spoke of it. The notebooks had stopped recording anything useful. Pens leaked, pencils snapped. The machines turned on without command. The generator stayed warm, but no longer needed fuel. Merrick approached the old console again, and this time, without touching it, a voice began to rise. The woman's voice, but reversed, slowing into comprehensible fragments. She was reading names. Their names. Not just those present, but names from their pasts. Teachers, mothers, dead friends. Spoken not in grief, but as inventory. Merrick whispered to himself, "It's counting." And he wasn't wrong. The pulse matched the syllables, and the list seemed endless. It wasn't calling out to them. It was checking who had answered. It began as a hum, not the mechanical whine of radio equipment or the tonal residue of snow-muffled wind, but something closer to memory, familiar and unfinished. Merrick stood alone before the main console, where the oscillograph no longer danced in erratic waves, but now moved with unnatural regularity, as if synchronized to a metronome outside time. The others slept or pretended to. After Doosan's collapse, no one trusted the dark with their eyes closed. But silence had ceased to offer safety. Every still moment invited something deeper to surface. Words unsaid, acts buried beneath obligation. The full weight of personal guilt etched on old uniforms. Merrick opened his notebook again, running his fingers over the diagrams he had redrawn from the ensign logs. Between the ink lines under the diagrams of antennae and frequencies, one word was repeated in faint, hurried strokes. Oral. He hadn't noticed it before. It appeared like a watermark, visible only when the paper caught light from a specific angle. He said it aloud. The console responded. The screen flickered, then displayed coordinates. Not the usual grid. These numbers belonged to an abandoned system of location and coding, used only in experimental Soviet transmissions, scrapped a decade prior. Merrick recognized them. They pointed to a clearing half a kilometer above the bunker, where an early antenna had been set up in the first winter of the occupation, and then supposedly decommissioned after collapse in 1942. He dressed quickly, not speaking to the others. The air outside had turned thinner, metallic on the tongue, and the snow crackled underfoot as if resisting movement. The path up was steep, the kind only goats or fools would climb in such weather, but Merrick moved with clarity now. He wasn't just following orders. He was tracing a scar. The antenna wasn't buried. It stood, skeletal and whole, beneath a frame of collapsed trees that had grown and died around it. Its base was half swallowed by ice, but it pulsed visibly, a faint glow beneath the frost, like blood beneath translucent skin. Wires ran out from its center and disappeared into the mountain, not into earth, but into old rocks scorched black. Merrick placed his hand on the core. It wasn't cold. He felt warmth not as heat, but as awareness. The hum became structured. A message played in repetition in Morse, but it wasn't coded in dots and dashes. It was names again, his own, Etienne, Anka, names from his past, names he never spoke aloud, names that had only lived in his private notes, or in regret. The pulse of the antenna beat in time with his chest. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Pause. The rhythm was identical to the first experimental sequences from Prague, years ago, before the war. The same patterns he and his colleagues had used in the ministry's covert acoustics project. Those notes had been destroyed, or so he believed. The voice that emerged now from the bass wasn't his. It wasn't human at all, but it had learned his cadence. It spoke in Czech, then in French, then in Latin. The same sentence, over and over. You open the signal. You cannot unspeak what was heard. Merrick collapsed to his knees, not from fear, from certainty. This antenna wasn't abandoned. It had never stopped. It had been speaking all along, waiting for someone to understand. It hadn't been sending. It had been listening, recording, learning the shape of thought through the scars of language. And now it was answering, not with prophecy, with memory. Merrick descended the path in silence, the frozen breath in his lungs heavier than the air itself. The antenna's pulse continued behind him, steady and indifferent. No questions, no permission, just response. Inside the bunker, the others had gathered in the equipment room, their faces grayed by exhaustion and something more elemental, exposure to something they couldn't name. Dusan, pale and silent since the collapse, now whispered words none of them had taught him, words that sounded like syllables bent backwards. Zora sat against the wall, drawing circles into frost on the floor, murmuring a lullaby none of them recognized. The static on the radio had changed too. It was no longer random. It followed breath. It paused when they paused. It exhaled when they did. Merritt closed the door behind him and placed a notebook on the central table. He pointed to the name written under every sketch. Oro, the name they had all heard but none had dared pronounce since the second day. He said it aloud again. This time, no flicker. The lights didn't dim. Nothing mechanical reacted. But Dusan stood. Zora looked up, and from the speaker, a voice began, not just heard, but felt. Etienne's voice. Merrick didn't need confirmation. It was his phrasing, his rhythm, the slight lift at the end of every third word, as if he were reciting poetry instead of language. But Etienne was dead, had been for 5 years. Merrick had seen the photograph. The voice read from a text neither he nor the others had ever written. It described moments they hadn't lived. Yet every word fit, like a diary of memories they were just now beginning to recall. Descriptions of a room with copper walls, of 7 men kneeling in snow, of a single voice teaching silence how to speak. Merrick reached for the cable switch. His fingers hesitated. Destroying it might do nothing. This wasn't radio. This wasn't data. This was something deeper, embedded in signal the way scars embed in flesh. They couldn't erase it, but they could choose what remained. They loaded explosives at the tunnel's mouth. Not enough to collapse the entire mountain. That would take days and more supplies than they had. But enough to bury the exposed cables, the chambers, the transmitter core. Merrick stayed behind as the others evacuated. He walked through every room, retracing steps not as a soldier but as an engineer, as a man returning to the blueprint of his own guilt. He sat at the console one last time. The hum returned, not angry, not loud, just present, waiting. He opened the notebook to the final page and began writing, not a report, a confession. Every frequency he helped design, every note he remembered hearing, every line of dialogue he once dismissed as auditory artifact. At the end of the page, he wrote a phrase in Czech, Zvuk nebul chaiba. The sound was not a mistake. Then he placed a notebook in the radio casing, behind the loose panel he had found days earlier, and wired it shut. He returned to the entrance. The others were already down the slope. Merrick set the charge. For a moment, he hesitated, not from fear, but from something like mercy toward the voice that had followed him all this way. Then he triggered the detonation. The earth shuddered but did not cry out. Dust, snow, and wire folded together like a curtain falling on a stage long past its final act. When the silence returned, it was real, not the absence of noise, but the closing of a circuit. The hum was gone. No reply. No pulse. Just snow beginning to fall again in steady rhythm, untouched by war or memory. In the valley below, the others waited. Days later, a new team would come and find only ice and rocks. No sign of transmission. No entry. Just a note left in Zora's pocket, in Marek's handwriting. We buried the echo, let it rest,